Some forgeries fail because the ink betrays them. Others survive for 30 years and more, and fail only on the day someone finally teaches herself to read what has been left out of a page rather than what has been written on it. In the autumn of 1843, a bookbinder from Leominster was asked to mend a burned archive, and by the time she understood what she had actually been hired to find, a man she had come to trust was standing in a cell because of her. The carriage that brought Theodosia Harrow up the Marlstone Drive that morning had been sent by the family solicitor himself, and she had spent most of the journey with her satchel of tools braced between her boots so that the jolting of the road would not loosen the pins from her folding case. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, quiet-featured, with ink stains at the second and third fingers of her right hand that no amount of pumice ever fully lifted. She had inherited the workshop on Broad Street from her father, who had died 4 years before, and with it she had inherited his eye, which saw a sheet of paper the way other people saw a face, at once whole and made of 100 small particulars that did not lie. Wat Colley rode beside her with the tool chest lashed across his knees. He was 19, thin through the shoulder still, though he had been apprenticed to her for 3 years, and could pare a spine as neatly as she could herself. He kept twisting round to look back at the hedgerows, at the hop poles standing bare in the wet fields, at the low gray line of the Malvern hills away to the east. "I have never been so far from the shop before," he said. "It is 11 miles, Wat." It felt further, he said, and she did not correct him, because in a way he was right. The country changed as the road climbed out of the river valley. The orchards gave way to older woodland, oak and ash close along the verges, and the hedges here were high enough to hide the fields entirely, so that Marlstone Hall seemed to rise out of nothing when the carriage finally came round the last bend. Long and gray and stone-fronted, with 2 square towers at either end of the roofline, and a scaffold of raw timber standing against the eastern wing like a scar. Josiah Fell was waiting at the foot of the steps before the wheels had fully stopped. He was 54, spare, and stooped a little at the neck from a lifetime bent over deeds, with spectacles pushed up onto his forehead and a coat that had seen better winters. He had been the family's solicitor for as long as anyone at Marlstone could remember, and he handed Theodosia down from the carriage with the careful courtesy of a man who had once known her father and still felt the debt of it. "You will forgive the state of the drive, Miss Harrow," he said. "We have had carters through it all week, taking away what could not be saved." "How bad is the room, Mr. Fell?" "Bad enough that I did not trust my own judgment of it," he said, "which is why I wrote to you rather than to anyone nearer at hand. Come and see for yourself before anyone tells you what to think of it." He led her and Wat in through a side door rather than the great hall, along a stone passage that smelled of damp plaster, and beneath that, faintly, of smoke that had long since gone cold. The muniment room lay at the end of the east wing, a low chamber with a barrel ceiling that had once held the estate's deeds and rentals, and correspondence in oak presses along every wall. Half of those presses were now blackened ruins, their doors hanging loose on scorched hinges, their contents either ash or else swollen into solid gray blocks, where the fire brigade's water had done what the flames had not finished. Theodosia stood in the doorway a long moment before she went in. She had seen fire damage before, in a parish chest once, and in a merchant's account books after a warehouse blaze in Hereford, but she had never seen so much of a family's paper history reduced in a single night. "When did it happen?" she asked. 3 weeks past, Fell said. "The night of the 12th. The steward smelled smoke past midnight and had the household out and the well bucket chain going within the quarter hour, or it would have taken the roof as well as the room. As it is, we lost perhaps 2/3 of what was kept here. Rentals back to the last century, correspondence, certain family papers that his lordship would have wished kept whole." His lordship, Theodosia said. That would be the new earl. 6 months in the title, Fell said, and something passed briefly over his face that she could not read, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "Lord Rushford succeeded his cousin last spring. You will meet him presently, I have no doubt. He takes a close interest in the work." She moved into the room and crouched before the nearest press, and for a while she forgot the solicitor entirely, because the work itself took hold of her the way it always did, the way her father had told her it would, From the very first time, he set a damaged leaf in front of her as a girl of 9 and told her that paper remembered everything that had ever happened to it, if only she troubled to ask. Most of what remained was not burned outright, but scorched at the edges and swollen from the water. The pages fused into hard gray wads that would need to be steamed apart, one leaf at a time, dried under weight, the ink tested before anything was touched with a brush. Some volumes had survived nearly whole, protected by the very presses that had failed to save their neighbors, the doors having warped shut before the worst of the heat reached inside. She began sorting by instinct, worse damage to one side, salvageable to another, and she did not notice Watt had stopped helping her until she looked up and saw him standing very still by the door, and behind him, filling it, a man she had not heard approach. He was 41, she would learn later, though in that first moment she took him for older. There was a heaviness about him that had nothing to do with years, a stillness in the shoulders of a man accustomed to being watched and to watching in return. He wore morning gray still faded at the cuffs, and a signet ring too large for the hand that wore it, as though it had been made for someone else, and never properly altered. "Miss Harrow," Fell said, rising. "May I present his lordship, the Earl of Rushford?" Theodosia rose and made her curtsy, and Marchant inclined his head in return, with a courtesy that did not quite reach his eyes. "I am obliged to you for coming so far," he said. His voice was pleasant, unhurried, the voice of a man who had trained himself long ago never to sound as though anything troubled him. "Fell speaks very highly of your father's work. I trust the daughter has inherited the skill along with the trade." "I hope so, my lord." He came further into the room and stood looking down at the ruined presses with an expression she could not place, something between distaste and calculation, and she thought at the time it was only the natural discomfort of a man surveying a loss. "You will want to know where to begin," he said. "I would ask that you leave the northern press for last. The papers there are older still, and of no great consequence now, family correspondence mostly, nothing that touches the estate accounts. I would not have you waste your skill on what cannot signify." Theodosia looked at the press he indicated. It stood nearest the window, less scorched than most of its neighbors, its door hanging a little open on a warped hinge so that she could see, even from where she stood, the pale edges of paper that had survived the fire almost entirely whole. "Of course, my lord," she said, and something in her, the same something that had once told her a parish register was 2 hands and not one before anyone had thought to question it, filed the request away, and did not forget it. Marchant stayed only a few minutes longer, asking Fell some question about a tenant's lease that had been lost in the fire and would need reconstructing from memory and from the tenant's own copy, and then he left them with a final courteous word to Theodosia about sparing no expense in the work, and the room seemed to breathe more easily once his footsteps had faded down the passage. Watt let out a breath through his teeth. "He does not smile much, does he?" "Not every man needs to," Theodosia said, though she found herself glancing once more at the northern press before she turned back to her sorting. They worked through the better part of the day, Watt carrying water for the steaming kettle and stacking dried boards for the pressing, Theodosia separating leaf from leaf with a bone folder so fine it left no mark on paper that had already suffered enough. By late afternoon, the light through the tall windows had gone the color of weak tea, and her back ached from bending, and it was in that hour, tired and unguarded, that she first met the man who called himself Crake. He came into the muniment room without knocking, as a man does who has been given leave to go where he pleases, carrying a canvas satchel and a folding rule under one arm, and he stopped just inside the door when he saw her, as though he had expected the room to be empty. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I did not know anyone was still at work in here." He was tall, and carried himself very straight in a way that sat oddly with the plainness of his coat, brown wool, well made but without ornament, the coat of a man who wished to be thought modest, and had perhaps overdone the modesty a little. His hands, when he set down the satchel, were not the hands she would have expected of a survey clerk, the nails too well kept, the grip on the rule too easy and precise, though she thought nothing of it in that first moment, beyond a passing, unexamined notice. "I am only finishing for the day," she said. "You are the surveyor Mr. Fell mentioned." "Crake," he said. "John Crake. I am here about the eastern boundary, the old dispute with the Thornbeck tenancy. His lordship wished the line settled properly before winter closes the ground. Theodosia Harrow, she said, I am mending what the fire left of the muniment room. A poor business, that fire, he said, and his eyes went briefly to the northern press, with its warped door and its pale unburned papers, showing through the gap, the same press merchant had asked her to leave until last, and something in the set of his mouth changed for the space of a breath before he mastered it and looked away. You knew the room before the fire, she said. It was not quite a question. I have had occasion to pass through it, he said, which was, she thought afterwards, a careful answer, the answer of a man weighing exactly how much truth a sentence could carry without becoming a lie outright. I will not keep you from your supper, Miss Harrow. I am told the housekeeper does not care to be kept waiting past 6. He bowed, not quite the bow of a clerk to a tradesman's daughter, and was gone before she could ask him anything further, his footsteps unhurried and even down the stone passage. And Theodosia stood a moment longer amid the scorched presses with her bone folder still in her hand, turning over, without quite knowing why, the particular way a man who claimed to survey boundaries for a living had looked at a locked press full of old family letters, as though he already knew, better than she did, exactly what was kept inside it. She took her supper that first evening in the small parlor, off the kitchens, at the housekeeper's invitation, among the upper servants and Fell's own clerk, a quiet, respectable meal of mutton and boiled potatoes that suited her a great deal better than any grander table would have done, and afterward, rather than going straight up to the narrow room above the old dairy, she carried a candle back down to the muniment room and sat a while longer among the scorched presses with her father's old memorandum book, open upon her knee, the small worn volume in which he had, across 30 years of practice, set down every remedy he had ever discovered for every particular affliction paper could suffer. Theodosia Harrow had grown up believing, as a child believes the shape of the only world she has ever known, that every house smelled of paste and vellum, that every father spent his evenings bent over a press with a bone folder in his hand, and it was not until she was 9 or 10 years old, sent along on an errand to a neighboring farm, that she had understood other households did not keep, in a place of honor, upon the parlor mantel, a single perfect quarto her own father had bound, as a young man, its spine still supple after 20 years, kept there not for its contents, which were nothing more than a country parson's sermons long since forgotten, but as a standing reminder to any apprentice who ever doubted the value of doing careful work that a book properly made would still be opening cleanly upon its hinges long after the man who made it, and very likely the man who first read it, had both gone into the ground. He had taught her, before he taught her anything of the craft's finer mechanics, that paper was the most honest material a person could hope to work with, more honest by far than cloth or stone or the spoken word, because paper could not talk itself out of what it had witnessed. Ink faded according to its own recipe and no other. A quill cut for a right hand left a different weight of stroke than a quill cut for a left. A sheet made in one mill carried, if a person knew how to look for it, the particular pattern of wires that had shaped it while the pulp was still wet, a maker's mark as individual, in its way, as a face. Your eye will lie to you before your fingers ever will, he used to tell her, setting some deliberately puzzling fragment before her at the workbench, some proof sheet with a correction inked over in a second hand, some ledger page where a column had been recopied to hide an error, and asking her to tell him, before she was permitted to touch it at all, what story the paper itself was trying to tell her, quite apart from whatever the words upon it claimed. She had thought, sitting in the muniment room that first night, with the candle guttering low and the cold coming up through the stone floor, that her father would have found the whole business of Marlstone Hall a puzzle very much after his own heart. A locked press a lord did not wish opened, a surveyor who was plainly no surveyor at all, an old family's grief and an old family's shame folded together into a single roomful of damaged paper. And she thought, too, with a small private smile that had nothing to do with amusement, that he would have told her exactly what he always told her when a piece of work looked larger and more tangled than any single evening's patience could hope to untangle, which was that a person did not mend a whole archive in a single sitting, any more than she rebuilt a whole ruined binding in a single pass of the needle. She mended what lay directly in front of her, one leaf, one stitch, one honest observation at a time, and trusted that the larger shape would eventually declare itself, the way it always did, if only she was patient enough not to force it. She closed the memorandum book at last and rose, her knees stiff from the cold stone, and paused on her way to the door before the northern press once more, its warped hinge still holding the door a half-inch open, the pale unburned papers within it, catching the last of her candlelight. She did not open it, but she found herself standing there in the dark and quiet room, running through her father's own rule one final time, before she blew out the candle and went up to bed, that a locked door told a person almost as much as an open one did, provided she troubled herself to ask why it had been locked at all, and by whom, and against precisely what particular truth the lock had been meant to hold back. She slept badly that first night in the room the housekeeper had given her above the old dairy, a narrow chamber, with a sloped ceiling and a window that looked out over the stable yard. And she woke before 6 with the particular clarity that came to her sometimes, after a difficult day, when her mind had gone on working through the dark hours without troubling to ask her leave. She lay a while listening to the grooms moving about the yard below, and then she rose and dressed and went down to the muniment room before breakfast, wanting an hour alone with the presses before Watt arrived and before anyone else came to watch her work. The northern press stood exactly as it had the day before, its warped door hanging a half-inch open, the pale edges of paper visible in the gap like teeth behind a lip. She did not open it. She had given her word, or near enough to a word, and there was besides a great deal of honest work waiting in the presses she had been given leave to touch. But she found, as she knelt before the nearest ruin and began lifting the first swollen block of pages free with both hands, that her mind kept circling back to it the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth, not from any wish to worry it, but because it could not quite believe the shape of the thing. Fell found her there an hour later, and seemed pleased rather than surprised to discover her already at work. "You keep early hours, Miss Harrow. My father always said, the paper forgives more in the morning than it will by candlelight," she said. "The eye is honester before the day has tired it. A wise man, your father." He was, she said, and set down the block she had been working at, to press her palms flat against the small of her back. "Mr. Fell, may I ask you something that is perhaps not properly my business?" "You may ask. I do not promise to answer," the northern press. His lordship was very particular that I should leave it until last. I wondered only whether there was some reason beyond its contents being of no consequence, since I confess the papers I can see through the door do not look to me like papers of no consequence. They look very well kept for family letters no one troubles to read. Fell was quiet a moment. Turning his spectacles over in his fingers in the way she had already learned meant he was choosing his words with some care. "There is a dispute," he said at last, "that has run in this family a long while, longer than the fire, and longer than the present earl's tenure of the title. You will have gathered that Lord Rushford came into Marlstone, and the earldom upon his cousin's death last spring by entail. That succession is not disputed by anyone, nor could it be. The entail runs in the male line without exception, and his lordship stood nearest. But there is something that is disputed," Theodosia said. "There is a second property," Fell said. "Thornbeck, some 7 miles east of here, a freehold, not bound within the entail at all. It was left, 3 generations back, by old deed of settlement, to the lawful issue of a younger son of the house, a provision quite separate from the main inheritance, made so that the second line should not go entirely without a portion of its own. If no lawful issue can be shown to exist, the deed provides that Thornbeck reverts to the principal estate, to Marlstone, to whoever holds the earldom, and the younger son's line," Theodosia said slowly, "does it survive?" "There is a claimant," Fell said, and here his voice grew careful again, guarded in a way she had not heard from him before. "A young man who believes himself the lawful grandson of that younger son, and who would, if his claim were proved, take Thornbeck entirely out of his lordship's hands. The papers that would settle the matter one way or the other, the marriage records, the family letters that speak to it, are precisely the sort of thing one would expect to find in a room such as this. In the northern press, Theodosia said. Fell did not answer that directly, but he did not need to, and after a moment he put his spectacles back upon his nose as though to signal the conversation had gone as far as he intended to let it go, and asked her instead what she would require sent up from Hereford for the steaming work, and she let him steer her back onto safer ground, though she did not forget what he had told her, turning it over that whole morning, the way she turned over a difficult binding, looking for the seam that would tell her how it had been made. Watt arrived a little after 8, yawning, with straw still caught in his hair from the loft where the grooms had found him a bed, and the two of them settled into the steady rhythm of the work, the kettle hissing on its little iron stand, the pages coming apart one by one under careful hands, laid flat between blotting boards to dry. It was slow work, and it suited her, the particular patience of it, the way a ruined thing could be coaxed back toward wholeness if only one did not hurry it. It was in the general correspondence, not the northern press but a smaller chest that Fell had set aside for her from an upstairs closet, letters of no legal weight but of some sentimental value that the family wished preserved regardless, that she came upon the boy's hand for the first time. It was a single sheet, water-stained at one corner, but otherwise whole, a short letter dated some 16 years before, addressed to the old earl, the one before Rushford, in a careful, rounded, schoolboy script that had clearly been made to sit up straight and behave itself. My dear great-uncle, it began, I thank you most sincerely for the pocket-knife, which is a very fine one, and I have already used it to good effect upon a willow whistle, though nurse says I am not to be trusted with it near the dogs. I remain your affectionate great-nephew, Julian Northmore. Theodosia set the letter down carefully upon its blotting board and looked at it a long moment. There was nothing remarkable in it, a boy's thanks for a gift, the sort of letter every family kept a drawer of somewhere and never quite threw away. But the name caught at something Fell had said that morning, and she found herself reading it again, this time with her eye rather than her ear, the way her father had taught her to read a hand, not for what it said, but for how it had been made. The J was formed with a small looping flourish at the top that most children were taught out of by the time they reached 15. The downstroke of the L leaned very slightly backward, against the natural slant of a right-handed writer, a habit that came, she thought, of having been made to write with the left hand, bound behind the back, at some early stage of a stricter sort of schooling, and never quite unlearned. She had seen a hand do that once before, and only once, and quite recently. She did not let herself finish the thought. She set the letter carefully into the box of papers to be catalogued rather than restored, since it needed no mending, only its place recorded, and she went back to her steaming and her blotting boards, and told herself the resemblance was nothing. A trick of memory, the sort of thing a tired eye invented at the end of a long day when it wanted a mystery to relieve the tedium of honest work. Craik found her again 2 days later, in the small library that adjoined the muniment room, where she had gone to consult an old estate map for the boundaries of a lease she was reconstructing from a scorched fragment. He was bent over a table of his own near the window, his survey papers spread before him, a chain and a set of brass instruments laid out with a precision that seemed, again, oddly fine for a man whose coat was so plain. Miss Harrow, he said, rising, I hope I do not disturb your work. Not at all, Mr. Craik. I am only after the old parish map, if you have not claimed it for your own boundary lines. He handed it across without hesitation, and in doing so laid down for a moment the sheet of field notes he had been working from, close enough to her elbow that she could not help but see it, columns of measurements in a firm forward-leaning hand, and there, at the head of the page, a small heading, Thornbeck East March, surveyed this day, and beneath it his signature, not Craik, not any name at all in that moment, only the pressure and the shape of the letters themselves, the same looping flourish at the top of a capital that had no business appearing in a grown man's practical hand unless it had been put there young and never entirely trained out. She did not say anything. She took up the parish map and thanked him and returned to her own table, and it was not until she had unrolled the map and set its corners with 4 small lead weights that her hands, without her quite deciding they should, stopped moving altogether, and she sat very still, looking not at the map but past it, at nothing, while the whole shape of the thing arranged itself in her mind the way a swollen page finally came apart under steam, one clean fold at a time. A survey clerk did not know the muniment room before the fire touched it. A survey clerk did not glance at a locked press full of family letters, with the particular stillness of a man looking at something he had been forbidden and had not forgiven the forbidding. A survey clerk, above all, did not carry in his grown hand the unmistakable ghost of a boy's careful rounded letter to a great uncle he had thanked for a pocket-knife 16 years before, in a hand that had signed itself quite plainly, Julian Northmore. She looked across the little library at the man who called himself Craik, bent again over his instruments, entirely unaware that he had just handed her, along with an ordinary sheet of survey notes, the one thing he had been most careful, in every other particular, to keep from her. "Mr. Craik," she said, before she had quite decided to say anything at all. He looked up. "Miss Harrow." "Nothing," she said, "only that I find I have taken longer over this map than I intended, and the light is going. I will finish tomorrow." He inclined his head, unsuspecting, and bent back to his columns of figures, and Theodosia rolled the map with hands that were, she was faintly surprised to notice, entirely steady, and went out into the passage and stood a moment with her back against the cool stone, thinking not of forgery or of fire or of entails, but of a young man who had come back to the house that would have been his under a false name, watching a locked press that held the only proof of who he truly was, and trusting no one in it, not even, until this evening, by some strange chance, a bookbinder's daughter from Leominster, who had not been looking for him at all. The quarter day fell on a Thursday that autumn, and Theodosia, crossing the courtyard on her way to fetch fresh water for the steaming kettle, found the whole forecourt of Marlstone Hall unexpectedly crowded with tenant farmers, come to pay their Michaelmas rents, a line of carts and plain saddle horses drawn up along the gravel, the men themselves gathered in small, subdued knots waiting to be called in to the estate office, and she slowed without quite meaning to, curious despite herself at a piece of the household's ordinary business she had not yet had occasion to see. Watt, who had gone ahead of her with the empty pails, came back rather more quickly than the errand required, and stood beside her a moment, watching the same scene. "Bad harvest again," he said, low, the way a boy repeats something he has overheard from his elders without quite understanding all of it himself. "Mrs. Gethin in the kitchen says wheat has fetched nothing worth the growing these 3 years past, not since the foreign corn started coming in so cheap, and half these men owe more in rent than their whole crop will fetch them at market this Michaelmas." She had read of it herself, of course, in the Hereford papers that occasionally found their way into the shop on Broad Street, the long, bitter argument that had been running now for some years between those who wished the duties on foreign grain kept high to protect the price an English farmer could ask for his own wheat, and the growing body of manufacturers and reformers gathered under the banner of a league that met now in halls across half the kingdom's manufacturing towns, who argued just as fiercely that cheap bread mattered more to a hungry mill worker than a comfortable rent mattered to a landed gentleman. But she had read it as a distant, abstract quarrel, printed columns of speeches made in places she had never visited, and it was another thing entirely to stand in a graveled forecourt and watch it made plain in the stooped shoulders and carefully composed faces of a dozen men waiting to explain to a steward why they could not, this quarter, pay in full what the lease upon their land required of them. She recognized among the waiting tenants sits a broad, weathered man she had exchanged a few words with once before, a Thornbeck farm tenant named Iddens, who held one of the larger holdings on the estate's eastern edge, and she watched him go in when his name was called, and come out again some 20 minutes later with his hat held tightly in both hands, and his face set in the particular careful blankness of a man determined not to let his neighbors see exactly how badly the interview had gone. His lordship would not hear of any abatement, Iddens told her later, when she came upon him resting his horse at the trough, before setting off for home, and he seemed unprompted to want to say the whole of it to someone who was not another tenant. Says the estate's own obligations cannot wait upon the price of wheat, whatever the League and its friends in Parliament may be arguing this session, and that if a man cannot meet his rent, he had best consider whether farming Thornbeck land is truly the trade Providence intended for him. My own father held that farm before me, miss, and his father before him, and I do not know where a man of my years is meant to go looking for a different trade at this time of life, whatever his lordship may think of it from behind that desk of his. She thought of it a great deal in the days that followed, turning it over the way she turned over any piece of information that did not yet fit cleanly into the shape of a larger question, and it was fell, some evenings later. Over a supper the two of them shared alone in the small library, while Watt ate below stairs, who filled in the plainer arithmetic of the matter without her needing to ask. His lordship inherited an estate already carrying debts his predecessor had let grow unchecked, for the better part of a decade, Fell said, and he has inherited it, besides, at very nearly the worst possible season for a landowner to depend upon his rent roll for relief. Grain prices have not stood this low in a generation, Miss Harrow, whatever the merits of the argument on either side, and a man who owes considerably more than his acres presently earn him is a man under a very particular and very pressing kind of pressure, the sort that makes some men economize, and makes others, I am sorry to say, look about them rather more urgently than is entirely wise, for whatever ready money can be found, wherever it can be found, and by whatever means come most quickly to hand. He said no more than that, and did not need to, and Theodosia, walking back to her own small room above the dairy that night, found herself thinking not of the Northern Press, or the ledger fragment locked away in her traveling case, but of Iddens standing at the trough with his hat twisted in both hands, and of how very easily a man's private desperation, however grand his title, or however fine his coat, could come in the end to look a great deal like the ordinary desperation of any tenant farmer, counting the difference between what the land had given him and what a landlord's ledger insisted he still owed. A week passed, and then the better part of another, and the muniment room slowly gave up its wounded. Theodosia worked through the ruined presses one by one, leaving the Northern Press untouched as she had promised, and found, as she always did in this kind of work, that the ordinary papers taught her as much as the extraordinary ones, if she was patient enough to let them. Rentals told her who had farmed which field, and for how much going back 3 generations. Correspondence told her who had quarreled with whom, and over what, long after the quarrel itself had been forgotten by everyone still living. She began to know Marlstone the way she knew a client's whole shelf of books after long enough at the bench, not from any single volume, but from the accumulated weight of all of them together. The household self, she found, kept its own quieter kind of ledger, one written nowhere, but observed just as faithfully by anyone patient enough to watch it. Marchant took his breakfast alone and early, before even the steward was about, and rode out most mornings toward the home farm, and returned looking, more often than not, considerably less easy than when he had set out. He wrote a great many letters, sealed them himself rather than trusting them to a clerk, and rode to post them personally in the village rather than sending a groom, a habit the housekeeper mentioned once, over supper, with the faint puzzlement of a woman noting an oddity she did not fully understand the significance of. Theodosia noted it too, filing it away beside the Northern Press and the forbidden shelf, and the particular stillness with which his lordship watched her work whenever he believed himself unobserved, one further small stitch in a pattern she did not yet have enough thread to finish reading. It was the rental ledgers that gave her the most trouble, not because they were badly burned, several survived nearly whole, but because their spines had been repaired once already, years before the fire, by a hand she recognized the moment she opened the boards. Her father had bound for Marlstone for the better part of 30 years before his death, and she knew his stitching the way she knew her own, the particular tension he kept in the thread, the small economy of his cutting. She was working on the oldest of the surviving ledgers, a heavy volume recording rents and tenancies going back to the turn of the century, when she found that the spine her father had repaired had begun to fail again, the old paste gone brittle, the lining paper starting to lift from the boards. It was honest work to reline it properly, and she set about doing so on a quiet afternoon with Watt gone into the village on an errand for the housekeeper, working alone at the long table in the little library, with the volume propped open before her, and a fresh pot of paste, warming on the small stove fell, had allowed her to have brought up from the kitchens. The lining paper her father had used, when she finally worked it free, was not blank stock of the kind a binder bought new for the purpose. It was, as she had half expected, waste paper, salvaged sheets from some older, discarded work, cut down and pasted in to stiffen the spine, and save the cost of fresh board lining, a thing every binder did as a matter of course, her father most of all, who had never in his life thrown away a usable sheet of paper if there was any economy to be had in keeping it. She had done the very same thing herself, more times than she could count, with old proof sheets and canceled leaves and the fly leaves of ruined books no one would ever buy whole again. She set the freed lining paper down upon the table to examine it before it went, as such things generally did, into the fire, and found that it was not a single sheet but several, folded and pasted together to give the spine its proper stiffness, and that the innermost of them, protected all these years from light and handling by the sheets folded around it, was a page torn from an account book, ruled in narrow columns, the ink still dark and legible where the outer sheets had shielded it from fading. She did not at first understand what she was looking at. It was only a page of figures, sums received and sums disbursed, dated, she saw when she turned it to the light, some 18 years before, in a hand she did not know, careful and clerkly, recording rents received from a list of tenant farms she recognized from the very ledger she was mending. But halfway down the page the entries changed character. A sum was recorded as received from a certain Michaelmas rent, and then, in the same column but in a different, heavier hand, a second figure had been entered beneath it, smaller than the first, with the difference between the two struck through in a third entry and carried forward, unexplained, to a column headed simply disbursed, without further particulars, no name of tradesman or purpose given, only the figure itself repeated. She now saw, 3 times more further down the page, always the same pattern, a true sum received, a lesser sum recorded as passed on to the estate's principal account, and the difference vanishing into that same unexplained column. Theodosia sat very still for a long moment, with the page held carefully between 2 fingers, the way she held anything old enough to be fragile, and let her mind do what her father had taught her to let it do before she reached for any conclusion at all. She turned the page over. On the reverse, half of it torn away where the sheet had been cut down to fit the spine, was the tail end of a signature, only the last several letters legible, a flourish beneath them that she had seen once already, on a very different document, initialing the correction of a tenant's lease that Fell had shown her not 10 days before, in his lordship's own hand, from the years before he held the title, when he had managed the estate on his elderly cousin's behalf while the old earl's health failed him. She did not need the whole name. She had seen enough of that particular flourish, the way the final stroke curled back beneath itself, like a man unwilling to commit fully, even to his own signature, to know exactly whose hand had entered the second, smaller figure, and whose hand had swept the difference away into a column that named no one and explained nothing. She sat with the fragment a long while before she did anything at all. Her first instinct, honest and immediate, was to think of Fell, to carry the page directly to him, and lay it upon his desk and ask him what he made of it. But she found, turning the thought over, that she did not yet trust it enough to hand to anyone, not because she doubted what she saw, the arithmetic was plain enough that a child could have followed it, but because a single torn page, salvaged by chance from a binding 18 years old, proved only that money had once gone astray, not who had taken it, nor where the rest of the truth might be found. It would want more than one page. It would want, she thought, looking again at the warped door of the northern press 2 rooms away, considerably more than one page. She wrapped the fragment carefully in a clean sheet of blotting paper and locked it into the small traveling case in which she kept her own most delicate tools. The case Watt was never permitted to open without her standing over him, and she told no one, not Fell, not Watt, and certainly not the man who called himself Crake, though she found herself, in the days that followed, watching him rather more closely than she had before, wondering how much of what she now half suspected he had already worked out for himself, alone, in whatever quiet hours a man spent when he was pretending to survey a boundary he had known since boyhood. The letter from Mrs. Kenrick arrived 4 days later, forwarded up from Leominster by the shop's neighbor, and it was the first sign Theodosia had that Rushford, or someone acting for him, had begun to move against her in a manner she could not simply set aside and think about later. Mrs. Kenrick was a canon's widow in Hereford, for whom Theodosia had, the previous spring, rebound a set of family Bibles, work she had been rather proud of, and the letter, when she opened it at the little library table with cold hands, since the fire in the small stove had gone down and she had not troubled to build it up again, was brief and cold in a different way entirely. "Dear Miss Harrow," it began, without the warmth Mrs. Kenrick's letters generally carried, "I write to say that I shall not, after all, require your services for the restoration of my late husband's sermon notes, which I had intended to entrust to you this autumn. I have been given to understand by more than one person whose judgment I have no cause to doubt, that certain questions have arisen concerning the reliability of work carried out under your hand, and I am sure you will forgive a widow's caution in matters that touch so nearly upon her husband's memory. I remain, etc." Theodosia read it twice, and then a third time, and found that the careful formal phrasing told her almost nothing beyond the plain fact of the thing, that someone, somewhere, was speaking against her, in terms specific enough to reach a canon's widow in Hereford, and vague enough that Mrs. Kenrick herself evidently did not know precisely what she had been told, only that it had come from a source she trusted. She showed the letter to no one either, folding it into the same case that held the ledger fragment, though she noticed, that evening at supper in the small parlor, off the kitchens, where the upper servants and Fell's clerk and she herself generally took their meals, that Watt would not quite meet her eye across the table, and answered her ordinary questions about his errand into the village with an unusual shortness, and left the table before the pudding had gone round, saying he had a headache, though she had never in 3 years known Watt Colley to leave a pudding uneaten for any reason short of illness that kept him abed entirely. She thought little of it that night, tired as she was from the day's work, but she remembered it 2 days later, when she came upon Watt in the stable yard in low conversation with a man she did not know, a stranger in a good coat who was not one of the household, and not, from his boots and his bearing, a tradesman either, and who broke off the moment he saw her crossing the yard and touched his hat to her with a courtesy that felt, to her, considerably too smooth for a chance meeting, before walking off unhurried toward the gates, while Watt busied himself very suddenly with a coil of rope that did not, so far as she could see, require his attention at all. "Who was that?" she asked him when the stranger was well out of hearing. "No one, miss," Watt said, asking after the road to Bromyard, that was all. She did not press him further, though she noted, with the same quiet, unhurried attention she gave to a suspicious stitch or an ink that did not sit quite true upon a page, that Watt's ears had gone red at the tips, the way they always did when he was not telling her the whole of a thing, and that the man in the good coat had not, in fact, asked her the way to anywhere at all, since he had left by the very gate that led away from Bromyard and toward the Hereford road instead. He came to her the following evening, after the household had mostly gone in to supper, finding her still in the little library with the lamp lit and the ledger fragment spread before her upon a fresh sheet of blotting paper, and she knew from the way he stopped in the doorway, quite still, his hand still upon the frame, that he had come to say something he had been turning over for some time, and had not yet found easy words for. "Miss Harrow," he said, "I wonder if I might speak with you a moment, and I would ask that whatever you all already believe you know of me, you allow me to say it in my own order, since I have had a fortnight to arrange it in my head, and I find I do not wish to lose the thread of it now." She set down her pen. "You had better sit, Mr. Craik, or whatever I am to call you now." He came in and closed the door, which he had not done before in her presence, and drew a chair to the far side of her table, and for a moment he only looked at his own hands, laid flat upon the wood, before he began. "My name is Julian Northmore," he said. "I hold a captain's commission, though I am at present upon leave of absence I have not been entirely honest in requesting. My father was Edmund Northmore, second son of a second son of this house, 3 generations back, and he married my mother in the year 1814 at the parish church of Eardisland, some 4 miles from here. I have a copy of the register entry, taken by my father's own hand in a family Bible, long before any of this trouble began, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it to the satisfaction of a court, that the entry in the parish book itself, the true original, will bear it out precisely as the copy states. If it does, then I am my father's lawful son, and Thornbeck is mine by the settlement of my great-grandfather, and no power on earth can take it from me. If it does not, or if it can be made to appear that it does not, then I have no claim at all, and Thornbeck falls to whoever holds the earldom, which is to say, since some months past, to my cousin Selwyn Marchant. You came here under a false name to look for the proof yourself, Theodosia said. I came here, he said, because 6 weeks ago I received a letter from a clerk in Hereford, a man who owed my father a kindness once and has not forgotten it, warning me that questions had begun to be raised quietly, in certain legal quarters, about the validity of my parents' marriage. I came to see for myself whether the papers that would settle the matter still existed, and in what state, before I announced myself and gave whoever wished me ill the chance to see me coming. 3 weeks after I arrived, before I had so much as located the relevant press, the fire happened. Theodosia sat with that a moment, the small stove ticking as it cooled beside her. You believe the fire was set, she said, not an accident of a bad chimney. I believe, he said carefully, that I do not know, and that a man who has spent some years in the army learns not to build his case upon what he believes, but upon what he can prove, which at present is nothing at all beyond a fire that came very conveniently for someone, and a locked press that my cousin was at great pains to keep me, and you, away from until the last possible moment. She thought of the fragment lying between them on the table, still wrapped in its blotting paper, and after a moment, without quite deciding to, she unwrapped it and turned it toward him, and told him where she had found it, and how, and watched his face change as he read it, the careful stillness of a soldier giving way, briefly, to something rawer that he mastered again, almost as quickly as it appeared. 18 years, he said softly. He was robbing the estate 18 years ago, while he sat at my great-uncle's elbow managing it for him, because the old man's health would not permit him to manage it himself. And now he needs a debt covered that 18 years of quiet theft was never enough to cover, and Thornbeck is the last easy sum left to take. You cannot yet prove that either, she said, not unkindly. One torn page is a beginning, not an end. I know it, he said, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something closer to plain gratitude than the careful courtesy he had shown her until now. I did not expect to find an ally in a bookbinder sent up from Leominster to mend fire damage, Miss Harrow. I am glad to have been wrong. I have not yet agreed to be your ally, she said, though there was less severity in it than the words alone would have carried, and he smiled at that. Briefly, the first true smile she had seen from him, gone as quickly as it came. The formal challenge to the marriage came 9 days later, and it came, in the end, not through any private word from Fell, but through Rushford himself, who arrived at the muniment room one gray morning with a folded letter in his hand, and an expression of grave, regretful duty that Theodosia had already learned to distrust, precisely because it sat so easily upon him. Miss Harrow, he said, I understand you have lately made the acquaintance of a Mr. Crake, our surveyor. I have, my lord. It may interest you to know, since I understand you have some skill in these matters, and I would not have you taken unawares by gossip, that the gentleman is in fact my cousin, Captain Northmore, and that he has come here, under a borrowed name, to press a claim upon the Thornbeck estate that I have very great reason to doubt. I have this morning instructed my solicitor to lodge formal question before the diocesan authorities at Hereford as to the validity of the marriage entry upon which his claim depends. I tell you this only so that you may conduct yourself, in whatever further dealings you have with him, in full knowledge of the true state of affairs. He held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required, and she understood, without either of them saying it aloud, that this was not merely information. It was a warning, delivered with perfect civility, that she had been observed keeping company with his rival, and that her further usefulness to the estate might depend upon how wisely she chose to spend her sympathies from this point forward. I thank your lordship for the caution, she said, and gave nothing else away, and he seemed for a moment almost disappointed by how little her face told him, before he bowed and left her to her work. She went to Fell that same afternoon, and found him willing, this time, to speak more plainly than he had before, now that the matter had been carried into the open by Rushford's own hand. The entry in question, Fell said, is the marriage of Edmund Northmore and Frances Aylward, solemnist at Ardisland in the June of 1814. His lordship's solicitors contend that the ink of the entry does not match the ink of the entries immediately surrounding it in the register, and that this discrepancy points to the page, or the entry upon it, having been altered or inserted at some later date, to manufacture a lawful marriage where none had in truth existed. If that contention is sustained, Captain Northmore is no lawful son of his father, whatever his mother's own conduct or intentions, and Thornbeck falls to Rushford by the terms of the settlement. "May I see the register, Mr. Fell? It is not yet in our hands," he said. "It remains at Ardisland, in the vicar's keeping, as such books always must. But I believe the vicar would permit a properly credentialed examination, if his lordship's solicitors do not object first, and I think, Miss Harrow, that you are rather better credentialed for such an examination than any lawyer in Hereford." She rode to Ardisland 2 days later, with Fell himself for propriety, and with a letter of introduction he had procured from the diocesan registrar, and found the parish register a heavy, workmanlike volume, its vellum covers soft with age, kept in a strong box in the vestry, that the vicar, a mild, elderly man named Hollis, who seemed faintly bewildered by the whole proceeding, unlocked for her with visible reluctance. The entry itself, when she found it, was plain enough to the eye, a single line recording the marriage of Edmund Northmore, bachelor, and Frances Aylward, spinster, both of this parish, on the 14th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1814, witnessed by 2 names she did not know, the whole written in the vicar's predecessor's hand, a hand she compared, leaf by leaf, against a dozen surrounding entries both before and after it in the register, to satisfy herself it was indeed one continuous hand and not 2. It was the ink, precisely as Fell had said, that gave the trouble. The entries for April and most of May that year sat upon the page in a warm brownish black faded evenly with age. The entries from the latter half of June onward, including the Northmore marriage, showed a cooler, bluer black, noticeably different to the eye even without a lens, and she understood at once why a lawyer looking for a lever to pry the claim apart had seized upon it, since to an untrained eye the change looked exactly like what forgery so often did look like, a foreign ink introduced where none should be. She spent the better part of 2 hours with the register before she was satisfied, working not from the disputed entry alone, but from the whole run of pages around it, checking the ink of every baptism, every burial, every marriage recorded across that same span of weeks, and what she found, entry by entry, was that the change did not begin with the Northmore marriage at all. It began 4 entries earlier, in the baptism of a laborer's daughter recorded on the 9th of June, 5 days before the wedding, and it continued unbroken and consistent through every subsequent entry for the following 6 weeks, baptisms and burials and marriages alike, all in the same cooler ink, until the pattern shifted back again in early August. "There is no forgery here, my lord," she said, when Fell had brought Rushford's own solicitor to hear her findings the following week, in a small parlor at Marlstone, with the parish register laid open upon the table between them and Fell, standing at her shoulder like a second witness. "The ink changes because the clerk changed his ink, as every parish clerk in England does from time to time, generally when a bottle runs dry and a fresh one is mixed or purchased. The change begins 5 days before the entry in dispute, in a baptism that touches no one's interest in this matter at all, and it continues unbroken for 6 weeks afterward, through entries that could not conceivably have been altered for any purpose connected to Captain Northmore's claim, since they concern families who have no bearing upon it whatsoever. A forger inserting a single false entry does not also trouble to forge 5 entries before it and 30 after, in matters of no consequence to his purpose. He forges what he needs and no more. This is not that. This is only a clerk who bought new ink in the 2nd week of June, 1814, and used it faithfully until his bottle ran dry again in August. Rushford's solicitor, a narrow, careful man named Prosser, whom she had not met before, listened to all of this, with his lips pressed into a thin, unhappy line, and made a note or two, and said, when she had finished, that his lordship would of course wish to consider the matter further before withdrawing the challenge. He returned 4 days later, not through Prosser this time, but through a fresh letter delivered directly to Fell, and the letter did not withdraw the challenge at all. It abandoned the question of ink entirely, and raised, in its place, a new and considerably graver contention that the entire leaf upon which the marriage was recorded had, at some point after the true events of 1814, been removed from the register altogether and replaced with a new leaf, skillfully matched in age and hand, bearing a marriage that had never in fact taken place upon that day at all. Theodosia read the letter twice at Fell's desk, and felt, for the first time since she had come to Marlstone, something colder than professional interest settle into her chest, because she understood at once that Rushford had not been defeated by her examination of the ink. He had only been forced to abandon a weaker argument for a stronger one, and a claim that an entire leaf had been substituted could not be answered by comparing inks at all. It would require something else altogether, a record kept entirely outside the parish's own custody, made at the time and never afterward within Marlstone's reach to alter, and she knew, even as the thought formed, precisely where such a record was kept and precisely how far it now lay from where she stood. The evening before they were to set out for Hereford, Julian found her again in the small library, though this time neither of them pretended the meeting was accidental. She had spread her father's memorandum book, open beside the ledger fragment, checking for perhaps the third time that week that her account of the ink and the hand agreed in every particular with what she meant to say before the registry clerk, and he came in quietly and settled into the chair across from her without asking leave, as though the asking had, somewhere in the past fortnight, become unnecessary between them. "You work at this, the way another man might pray over it," he said, watching her turn a page. "My father used to say that a nervous binder makes a careless one," she said, "and a careless binder ruins more books than a clumsy one ever does, because clumsiness at least announces itself. I would rather check a fact 3 times too often than once too few, particularly when a man's whole inheritance is to be weighed against what I find." "Not only his inheritance," Julian said, and something in his voice made her look up from the page. "I have been turning something over these past days, Miss Harrow, and I find I would rather say it plainly than let it sit unsaid between us any longer, whatever answer it earns me. I came to Marlstone thinking only of Thornbeck, of proving a claim and settling a grievance that has sat with my family a great many years. I did not come expecting to find, in the middle of it, a woman whose good opinion has come to matter to me a great deal more than I anticipated when I first gave you a false name in a burned muniment room, and told myself it was only a matter of caution." She set down her pen carefully, giving herself a moment before she answered, though she found, when she did answer, that the words came more easily than she had expected. "I did not come to Marlstone expecting anything of the kind either," she said. "I came to mend paper. I have found myself instead defending a man's whole history before a chancellor's court, and comparing hands in the candlelight until my eyes ache, and I confess, Captain Northmore, that I have not minded any of it nearly so much as a sensible woman probably ought to have minded it." He smiled at that, the same brief, unguarded smile she had seen only once or twice before, gone as quickly as it came, though this time she thought she understood it a little better than she had the first time. "I will not ask you for any promise tonight," he said. "It would not be fair to either of us with so much still unsettled, and I have seen enough of the law these past weeks to know how quickly a man's whole prospects can be overturned by a single letter arriving from an unexpected quarter. But I wanted you to know, before we ride out tomorrow into whatever the diocesan registry has waiting for us, that whatever the transcript says, whatever becomes of Thornbeck, or of my name, or of anything else that has been argued over this autumn, I do not intend to let this particular acquaintance end merely because the business that began it has concluded. Nor do I," she said, and found, saying it, that it was the plainest and truest sentence she had spoken in a very long while. They sat a good while longer after that, talking of smaller things, her father's workshop and his years at his regiment, the particular quiet contentment of a conversation that no longer needed to circle constantly back to cord ledgers and registers and the careful business of proof. And it was only when the candle had burned low enough that Mrs. Halloway, the housekeeper, put her head in to ask whether either of them required anything further before she banked the kitchen fire for the night, that they realized how many hours had slipped past them unnoticed. And Theodosia climbed the stairs to her small room above the dairy that night, thinking that whatever the transcript at Hereford might or might not prove about a marriage entered into some 30 years before, she had learned, that same evening, a good deal more than she had expected to learn about the particular shape of her own heart. A leaf substituted within a parish register could be matched against nothing but itself, and a clever forger, given time enough and skill enough, could match paper and ink and hand closely enough to satisfy any eye that had only the register itself to compare it with. But every year, by ancient custom and by law, that no vicar in England had the liberty to ignore, a fair copy of every entry in every parish register was made and sent up to the bishop's registry, a bishop's transcript, kept forever afterward in the cathedral archive, entirely outside the parish's own keeping, entirely beyond the reach of anyone wishing to alter, decades later, what a register said. If the transcript for the June of 1814 showed the same marriage, in the same terms, then no leaf substituted at Marlstone's convenience, in the year of our Lord, 1843, could ever be made to agree with it, and Rushford's new contention would collapse as surely as his first had. It was Julian who explained the whole of this to her in the small library at Marlstone the evening the letter arrived, speaking with the quick, controlled urgency of a man who saw, for the first time in weeks, a path through ground he had believed entirely closed to him. "The transcripts are held at Hereford," he said, "in the diocesan registry beside the cathedral. If the entry for our marriage exists there, made and lodged in 1814 itself, no power on earth can call it a recent forgery, since no one at Marlstone has had access to the cathedral's own archive to tamper with it, nor could tamper with 30 years of transcripts besides, all of which would need to agree. And if it is not there," Theodosia said, "if it was never lodged or has been lost, then we are exactly where we stood this morning," he said, "and no worse off for having looked." Fell secured them a letter of introduction to the registrar within 2 days, and it was agreed, with a briskness that surprised Theodosia a little, that she would go with Julian to examine the transcript herself, since her eye was the one that would need to certify, before any court, that what she found there matched the disputed entry in every material particular. Watt came with them as far as the carrying of cases, and the management of the hired trap was concerned, glad of the change from the muniment room, and Fell remained behind at Marlstone to manage what he called, with a dryness she was coming to appreciate in him, the delicate business of appearing to know nothing whatsoever about any of it. They set out on a cold, bright morning, the hedges silvered with the first hard frost of the season, and the road toward Hereford ran easily enough for the first several miles. Through country Theodosia had traveled once or twice before on errands of her father's. It was only as they came within sight of the second turnpike, some 6 miles short of the city, that the trouble Fell had warned them of showed itself plainly. There had been unrest along the Welsh border roads for some years now, ever since the small farmers of the hill country had grown weary of tolls levied, as they saw it, unjustly upon lime and coal, and the ordinary traffic of their own poor holdings, and though the worst of the rioting lay further west, in the counties beyond the Wye, its temper had begun to spill over even into Herefordshire's own gates. The turnpike ahead of them stood with its bar splintered and half torn from its hinges, a knot of men gathered about the toll house with the particular stillness of a crowd that had already done its violence, and was now only deciding whether to do more, and the keeper himself nowhere to be seen. Julian drew the trap up short a good 100 yards off, and sat a moment weighing the road. "We can go round by the mill lane," he said. "It will cost us the better part of an hour, but I would rather lose an hour than drive a lady through the middle of that." "I have driven through worse than an angry crowd," Theodosia said, though she did not argue further when he turned the horse's head toward the narrower way, since she understood well enough that his caution was not for her comfort alone, but for the plain fact that a man traveling under a name that was not his own could not afford to be looked at too closely by anyone, crowd or constable alike. The mill lane brought them round by a longer road, deep between high banks, and it was theirs, some way along it, jolting hard over a rutted stretch where the frost had heaved the ground, that Theodosia glanced back and found Watt no longer sitting quite where he had been, but leaning far out from the rear of the trap, looking back the way they had come with an intentness that had nothing to do with scenery. "Is something amiss, Watt?" "Thought I saw someone on the road behind, miss," he said, and settled back into his place, though his ears had gone red again in the way she had learned to distrust, and she said nothing further, filing the moment away with the others. The stranger in the stable yard, the shortness at supper, the small accumulating weight of things that did not on their own prove anything, but that had begun, taken together, to sit very uneasily with her. They came into Hereford a little after noon, the cathedral's great square tower rising gray above the huddled roofs of the close, and found lodging, on Julian's arrangement, at the house of his aunt, Mrs. Honoria Pruitt, a widow of 60, who kept a narrow, comfortable house near the cathedral green, and who received them with a warmth that told Theodosia, before a word of explanation had been offered, that this was a woman who had known Julian's true name and true history a great deal longer than anyone at Marlstone. "So this is the Miss Harrow you wrote me of," Mrs. Pruitt said, taking Theodosia's hands in both her own with a directness that put her instantly at ease. "My nephew tells me you have done more for his cause in a fortnight than his lawyers have managed in 6 months. You will stay here, of course, both of you, and I will hear no argument about it, though I dare say propriety requires. I remind you that this house has a great many empty bedchambers, and I intend to see them used properly." The diocesan registry occupied a low, ancient building tucked behind the cathedral's north transept, its records kept by a stooped, precise clerk named Wardle, who examined their letter of introduction with the slow suspicion of a man who had seen a great many letters of introduction in his time and trusted very few of them. He warmed, however, once Theodosia began asking her questions in the particular language of the trade, the correct terms for gathering and choir, and the binding of annual transcripts into decade volumes, and within the hour he had brought out, from a locked press at the rear of the muniment chamber, the bound volume containing the loose transcripts sent up from the parish of Ardisland for the years 1810 to 1820. It took the better part of an afternoon to find what they sought, since the transcripts for each year had been bound in the order they were received rather than any order that made searching easy, and more than once Theodosia's heart sank as she turned past year after year that was not the one she wanted, 1811, 1812, a gap where 1813's transcript appeared to be entirely missing, filed. Wardle admitted with some embarrassment in the wrong decade volume some years before by a clerk since retired, an error he promised to have corrected, though it did nothing to help them that afternoon. It was Theodosia herself who found it in the end, not among the transcripts for Ardisland at all but bound, by the same misfiling error that had swallowed the year before it, into the rear of the volume for the neighboring parish of Monkland, a clerk's slip 1814 old, and never noticed since, and she felt something loosen in her chest, some tightness she had not fully admitted to carrying, when she turned the leaf and found, in a plain clerkly hand, entirely different from the parish register's own vicar's hand, the transcript of the Ardisland marriages for the summer of 1814, and there, third upon the list, the marriage of Edmund Northmore, bachelor, and Frances Aylward, spinster, on the 14th day of June, the date, the names, the particulars, all exactly as the parish register itself recorded them, made and lodged with the bishop's own registry within months of the marriage taking place. Decades before any fire, any earldom, any dispute over Thornbeck had ever entered anyone's mind. Julian, standing at her shoulder, was very quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up at him, she saw that his composure, so carefully kept through every difficult week she had known him, had for once entirely deserted him, and he said nothing at all, only reached out and touched the old page with 2 fingers, very lightly. As a man touches something he has waited a great while to be allowed to believe in. "It is enough," he said finally. "Tell me it is enough, Miss Harrow. It is independent of the register, made at the time, held ever since in a place your cousin has never had the power to reach, Theodosia said. I would stake my father's name upon it before any court in England. Wardle, watching them both with the faint indulgent air of a man who had seen a great many family disputes resolved and unresolved across his desk over the years, agreed to prepare a certified copy for the diocesan consistory court, where the challenge to the marriage had by now been formally lodged, and it was arranged that the hearing would be held within the fortnight, once Prosser had been given proper notice and the necessary parties summoned. They walked back to Mrs. Pruitt's house in the last of the afternoon light, the cathedral bells striking 4 somewhere behind them, and Theodosia found herself, for the first time since she had come to Marlstone, allowing herself to believe that the worst of it might already be behind them, that a torn ledger page and an old man's careful ink, and now this, a bishop's own transcript lying beyond anyone's reach, would together be enough to close the matter cleanly, and it was only much later that night, lying awake in the unfamiliar quiet of Mrs. Pruitt's best spare room, that she remembered Watt's red ears on the mill lane, and the stranger in the stable yard, who had claimed to be asking after Bromyard while walking briskly toward Hereford instead, and felt, for reasons she could not yet name, considerably less certain than she had an hour before. The hearing was fixed for the second Tuesday following, before the consistory court of the diocese, sitting under Sir Rowland Este, who held, as Mrs. Pruitt explained over supper the evening they returned from the registry, the double office of diocesan chancellor and county magistrate both, a common enough combination among lawyers of his generation, and one that would matter a great deal more before the week was out than any of them yet suspected. Theodosia spent the intervening days at Mrs. Pruitt's house, preparing her evidence with the same painstaking care she gave any difficult piece of work, drafting and redrafting the statement she would give before the court, comparing her notes of the register at Artisland against the certified copy Wardle had prepared, satisfying herself, leaf by leaf, that every particular agreed. It was a habit of hers, one her father had drilled into her from childhood, never to trust a single examination of an important document, however careful, without a second record made independently of the first, and she had, without thinking very much of it at the time, copied the whole of the disputed transcript entry into her own working notebook on the very afternoon they found it at the registry, in her own hand, dated and initialed, a plain professional precaution she had taken 100 times before on matters of far less consequence. Wardle himself had undertaken to bring the original transcript volume to the court under seal, since Prosser, true to his instructions, had written to insist that no mere certified copy would satisfy his lordship's challenge, that the original record itself must be produced and examined by the court, a demand that was, strictly speaking, within his rights, and that Wardle, after some grumbling about the risk to so old a volume, had agreed to honor, arranging for it to be carried under lock from the registry to the chancellor's own chambers the night before the hearing, to be held there in safe keeping until the court sat. It was gone by morning. Theodosia learned of it from Mrs. Pruitt's own maid, who came up breathless before Theodosia had finished dressing, saying that a messenger had come from the cathedral, close with word that Mr. Wardle begged Miss Harrow's presence at once, a matter of the gravest urgency, and she went down with her hair still half pinned, and her heart already, before she had heard a single further word, beginning to sink with the particular dread of a woman who has learned, over long practice, to read catastrophe in the shape of an unfinished sentence. Wardle met her in the registry itself, gray-faced, his hands shaking slightly, as he showed her the empty press, where the volume had lain under seal not 12 hours before, the lock forced, not broken outright, but sprung with some skill, by a hand that had known precisely what it was doing. "I do not understand it," he kept saying. "I do not understand how any man came at it. The chancellor's own clerk had the key. I had the duplicate. There were but 2 keys in all the world, Miss Harrow, and both accounted for the whole night through. They found Watt an hour later, in the stable behind Mrs. Pruitt's house, sitting on an upturned pail with his face in his hands, and it was Julian who found him first, and it was Julian's voice, low and controlled in a way that frightened Theodosia rather more than shouting would have done, that brought her running out into the yard in time to hear the whole of it. Watt had been approached, he said, weeks before, at Marlstone itself, by a man who knew a great deal about a debt his father owed in Leominster, a debt that could be called in at any hour and would see the family put out of the small holding they had scraped together across 2 generations. And the man had asked, at first, only for small things, which evenings Miss Harrow worked late, which papers she carried with her, and which she left behind. Nothing, the man had said, that could harm anyone, only information, freely given and freely forgotten. It was not until the mill lane, Watt said, his voice breaking entirely now, that the demands had grown larger, and by then he had already told too much to refuse telling more. And last night, when a note had been pressed into his hand at the kitchen door with instructions and a key that fit no lock he recognized, and a promise that his father's debt would trouble the family no further if he did as he was told, he had not had the courage, God forgive him, to say no. You let him into the Chancellor's chambers, Julian said. It was not a question. I only showed him the passage from the stable yard, Watt said. I never went in myself, I swear it, Captain, I never went in. Theodosia found she could not, in that moment, feel the anger she thought she ought to feel, only a kind of tired, aching pity, for a boy of 19 who had been made a tool of by a man who understood exactly how to find the weakest joint in any binding and press upon it until it gave. But there was no time to feel even that fully, because within the hour a constable had come to Mrs. Pruitt's door with a warrant, and the warrant did not name Watt Colley at all. It named Theodosia Harrow, on the sworn information of Mr. Josiah Prosser, solicitor, that she had, upon the night preceding, either herself removed or procured the removal of an ecclesiastical record held under seal for the purposes of a pending suit, an offense touching both the criminal law and the authority of the court itself, and that a leaf, torn plainly and recently from an old bound volume, bearing an entry in a hand consistent with the missing transcript, had that same morning been discovered, folded small in the lining of her own traveling case, where a chambermaid, sent to brush the dust from it before it was carried down to the trap, had found it, and, in some confusion, carried it directly to Mrs. Pruitt, who had, with evident distress, felt bound to send word to the Chancellor's office rather than conceal it. Theodosia stood in Mrs. Pruitt's small front parlor with the leaf laid upon the table before her, in Prosser's own hand now rather than her own, and understood, with the particular clarity that came to her sometimes in the worst moments, exactly what had been done, and exactly how neatly it had been done. The volume had not been stolen to destroy the evidence at all. It had been stolen so that a single leaf of it could be planted where it would be found, transforming a woman whose entire value to any court lay in her reputation for scrupulous, disinterested honesty into a woman suspected, on evidence that looked, to any eye that had not spent a lifetime handling old paper, entirely damning, of having tampered with the very record she claimed to have examined so faithfully. I did not take it, she said, to the constable, to Mrs. Pruitt, to Julian standing white-faced in the doorway. I did not put it there. You must see that I would have no reason to. The transcript as it stood supported the very claim I had already sworn to support. Why would I steal and mutilate the one document that already told in our favor? To make it appear his lordship's suspicions were justified all along, Julian said grimly. To have you discredited before you ever reach the witness box, so that whatever you say afterward, on any matter, in any court, can be waved aside as the word of a woman already known to have tampered with evidence once. The constable, a decent enough man by his manner, but plainly out of his depth, in a matter that had come to him wrapped in ecclesiastical language he only half understood, said he had his orders and must carry her before the Chancellor for examination, and it was there in Sir Rowland Estey's own chambers an hour later, with Prosser laying out his case with a cold, careful satisfaction that told Theodosia he had known precisely what he would find before he ever sent the constable, that Julian stood forward, before she could speak another word in her own defense, and said the thing that undid, in the space of a single sentence, everything he had spent 6 weeks so carefully building. The theft was mine, he said. Miss Harrow had no part in it, and no knowledge of it. I removed the volume myself, in the night, believing wrongly that its safety would be better assured in my own keeping than under a seal that had already once failed to protect it. The leaf found in Miss Harrow's case was placed there without her knowledge by my own hand in a foolish and ill-considered attempt to preserve a fragment of the record against the possibility that the whole should later be lost or challenged. I confess it freely, and I ask that whatever penalty attaches to the act should fall upon me alone. Theodosia opened her mouth to say that it was not true, that every word of it was a lie offered up whole to shield her, and found Julian's eyes upon her, steady and pleading in a way she had never seen from him, a silent and absolute command that she say nothing more, and Sir Rowland Este, watching the exchange with the flat, unreadable patience of a man who had presided over a great many family quarrels, dressed up as points of law, seemed to weigh the confession for a long moment before he spoke. "Captain Northmore," he said, "for I think we may dispense with the name Crake at this stage of proceedings. This is a grave admission, and one that touches not only the ecclesiastical law but the criminal law besides, since the theft of a sealed record held for the purposes of this court is an offense properly tried before the assizes, and not before me. I have no choice, upon your own confession, freely and publicly given, but to commit you for trial at the next sitting, and to inform your commanding officer of the circumstances, since a serving officer of the crown stands accused, by his own mouth, of an offense that cannot sit easily beside his commission." Julian bowed his head and said nothing further, and it was done with a swiftness that left Theodosia feeling as though the ground itself had tilted beneath her, the constable's hand upon Julian's arm, Prosser's thin satisfaction barely concealed behind his folded hands, Mrs. Pruitt's small cry from the doorway, where she had followed them, uninvited, and been permitted, out of some final courtesy, to remain. The jail keeper, a heavy-set man with more kindness in his manner than his office generally required, allowed her a quarter hour with Julian before he was to be moved to the county jail proper, and she found him sitting on the narrow bench of a bare holding cell, with his coat still buttoned to the throat, composed in the particular way she had come to recognize as the effort of a soldier, determined not to let a difficult hour see him unmanned. "You should not have come here," he said, rising as she was shown in. "It will not help either of us for it to be said, you visited a man committed on a charge of theft." "I did not come to help either of our reputations," she said. "I came because you have just told a lie to an ecclesiastical court on my behalf, and I find I cannot let you sit alone with the whole weight of it for even a single quarter hour without telling you, to your face, that it was not necessary, and that I would rather have taken my chances before Sir Rowland, honestly, than watched you throw away everything you have spent this whole autumn fighting to reclaim." "It was necessary," he said. "You did not see your own face, Theodosia, when that constable read the warrant. I have stood in worse places than this cell, under worse fire than anything Prosser could ever bring against me, and I have never once, in all that time, been as frightened as I was frightened, watching you stand there believing, even for a moment, that you might actually hang for a crime got up entirely to ruin you. You might yet be tried for it yourself," she said. "A false confession is no small matter before a criminal court, whatever kindness prompted it." "Then we will meet that difficulty when it comes," he said, and something in his voice softened, the composure cracking just enough to let something plainer through. "I have thought a great deal these past weeks about what a man owes to the truth, and what he owes to the people he has come to care for, and I find I do not regret, even sitting here, having chosen you over the coat, whatever it costs me in the weeks ahead. I would rather be an honest man ruined than a safe one who let you carry an accusation alone that was never yours to carry." The jail keeper's step sounded in the passage outside, the quarter hour plainly at its end, and Theodosia reached through the bars and took Julian's hand in both of hers, holding it a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, before the keeper's discreet cough obliged her to let it go. It was 3 days later, in a letter forwarded from his regiment's agent, that word reached Mrs. Pruitt's house of what had already by then been quietly settled elsewhere, that Captain Julian Northmore's commission had been accepted for resignation. Under circumstances, the letter did not trouble to soften. A discreet phrase that meant, as Mrs. Pruitt explained with tears standing plainly in her eyes, that whatever was proved or not proved at any future trial, the coat itself, the rank itself, The whole shape of the life he had built for himself, apart from Thornbeck and apart from Marlstone both, was already and permanently gone, surrendered in the space of a single sentence, spoken to save a woman he had known scarcely 2 months. Theodosia was not herself charged. In the end, Sir Rowland finding, with evident and grudging fairness, that a confession so complete left no ground to proceed further against her, but the ruin of it reached her all the same. Word traveled, as such word always did, faster and further than any correction could follow it, and within a fortnight, 2 further clients had written to withdraw commissions they had placed with her, one in terms nearly identical to Mrs. Kenrick's careful, regretful phrases, the other considerably blunter. And Fell wrote from Marlstone, with evident distress, that his lordship had thought it best, all things considered, that Miss Harrow's engagement there should be concluded, the remaining archive to be finished by another hand, her fee for the work already done to be settled in full, and without dispute. A courtesy she understood, reading it, to be exactly what it was, the closing of a door with as much civility as a man could manage, while still, quite unmistakably, shutting it. She sat a long while that evening, in the small bedchamber Mrs. Pruitt had given her, the ledger fragment and her own careful notebook laid out upon the coverlet before her, the only evidence left in the whole world that any of what she had found was true, and understood, with a clarity that offered her no comfort at all, that she had come to Marlstone to mend a burned archive, and had instead helped to burn, quite thoroughly, the one life among all the people she had met there that she had least wished to see destroyed. It was Mrs. Pruitt, in the end, who would not allow her to sit any longer with the ruin of it. She found Theodosia on the 3rd morning, still at the small writing table in the spare room, the notebook open before her, untouched, since the night she had first laid it there, and she came in without knocking and set down a tray of tea with a decisiveness that brooked no argument. "My nephew did not surrender his coat," Mrs. Pruitt said, "so that you might spend the rest of your days grieving over it in a borrowed bedchamber. He did it so that you might be free to finish what the 2 of you began. I have known Julian since he was in short coats, Miss Harrow, and I will tell you plainly, there is nothing in this world he would have hated more than to learn his sacrifice had bought you nothing but idleness." Theodosia looked up at her and found, beneath the older woman's briskness, something gentler, a plain and practical kindness that reminded her, unexpectedly, of her own father, and she closed the notebook and pushed back her chair. "You are right," she said. "Forgive me. I have been behaving as though the case were closed, when in truth it has only changed its shape." She went first to Wardle, and laid the notebook before him, and asked him to examine it against his own memory of the transcript he had held and lost, and though he could not certify a copy as he might have certified the original, he was willing, and glad, to swear before the court that the entry Theodosia had copied agreed in every particular with what he himself recalled of the volume before it vanished from his keeping, a lesser proof than the original, but not, she thought, a worthless one, especially set beside a register entry whose ink she had already vindicated once. It was 2 days later, while she sat drafting a fresh statement of her findings at Mrs. Pruitt's table, that Fell's letter arrived from Marlstone, and its contents drove every other thought from her head entirely. His lordship's solicitors, Fell wrote, have this week lodged a fresh notice with the consistory court, withdrawing the contention that the register entry itself was forged or substituted, and raising instead a wholly new objection to its effect. It is now asserted that Edmund Northmore was, at the date of his marriage to Frances Aylward, in June of 1814, already a married man, his first wife, one Susanna Northmore, formerly Susanna Yarrow, having wed him some years before at a parish in Shropshire, and that no proof exists, or has ever existed, that this first wife predeceased the second marriage. If the contention is sustained, the marriage to Frances Aylward was void from its inception, whatever the register may faithfully record of it, and Captain Northmore, whatever his parents believed themselves to be, was born to a union the law cannot recognize. Theodosia read it twice, and felt this time not the cold dread of the theft accusation, but something closer to a grim, weary anger at the sheer patient malice of a man who had, she now understood, prepared this second line of attack long before he ever needed it, holding it in reserve against precisely this contingency, so that no proof of the register's honesty, however complete, could ever be allowed to settle the matter. Julian, released upon Fell's own surety, and Mrs. Pruitt's besides, pending the assizes, took the news with a stillness that Theodosia was beginning to recognize as his particular way of carrying pain, no outward collapse, only a deeper quiet, a longer pause before he spoke. "I never heard my father speak of an earlier marriage," he said. "My mother never spoke of it. But I was a child when he died, and there is a great deal a child is never told." "If it is true," Theodosia said, "then no register, no transcript, no proof in the world can help you. And if it is false, then we must find the proof of that too, and quickly, before the assizes sits, and this is allowed to hang over everything else besides." They began, as she had begun every difficult search since her father first set her to it, with what could be verified, rather than what was merely claimed. A marriage in Shropshire, if it had truly taken place, would have left its own register entry, and Prosser's notice, when Fell forwarded a full copy of it, named the parish, a small place called Middle, and a year 1808. Julian wrote at once to the incumbent there, and received, within the week, confirmation that troubled them both a great deal. An entry did indeed exist. Edmund Northmore, bachelor, and Susanna Yarrow, spinster, married in the March of that year, plain and undisputed. The marriage was real, Theodosia said, when the letter came. That much, at least, we cannot argue away. What we must find is not whether it happened, but whether Susanna Northmore was living or dead by the June of 1814. It was Fell, writing again a few days later, who gave them the thread that led them at last to an answer, recalling almost as an afterthought at the close of a longer letter concerned with other estate business, that the parish clerk who had served at Irdisland at the time of Edmund Northmore's second marriage, a careful old man named Obadiah Tovey, long since dead himself, had left a widow still living somewhere in the neighborhood of Kingsland, a woman who had in her time kept house for her husband through 40 years of parish business, and who might, if anyone still living did, remember whether any word of an earlier, sorrowing history had ever passed between her husband and the Northmore family. Finding her proved harder than finding her memory once found, since Mrs. Tovey had removed from the clerk's old cottage some years before, and Fell's own recollection of her present situation was uncertain, and it was Julian, in the end, who thought to consult the enumerator's returns, taken 2 years before, for the whole kingdom, the great counting of every soul and every household that had been carried out in the summer of 1841, a copy of which, for the parishes of the district, Fell was able to obtain sight of, through a clerk of his acquaintance at the county office, and there, among the closely written columns for a small cottage on the Kingsland Road, they found her, Honora Tovey, widow, age 61 at the time of the count, occupation none, living alone. They found her 2 years further on, and rather more bent than the returns had suggested, in a small well-kept cottage, with a garden, gone half to seed for want of a strong back to tend it. And she received them with the particular pleasure of a lonely old woman, glad of any company at all, and grew a great deal more animated still. Once, Theodosia explained, gently, what had brought them. Obadiah always said there would be trouble over that marriage. One day, Mrs. Tovey said, settling them at her small table with a pot of tea, neither of them had the heart to refuse. He was a careful man, my husband, kept his own day book alongside the parish register proper, wrote everything down twice over, he used to say, for paper has a way of getting itself lost when a man least expects it, and he was right often enough that I never thought to argue with him about it. "Do you know anything of an earlier marriage, Mrs. Tovey?" Julian asked. To a woman called Susanna. The old woman's face grew thoughtful. "There was talk," she said slowly, "when Edmund Northmore first came courting Frances Aylward, that he had buried a wife some years before, up in Shropshire, and had grieved so hard and so long that half the parish thought he would never marry again at all. Obadiah looked into it himself, being a careful man, as I say, and satisfied himself the woman was truly dead and properly buried before ever the banns were called for the second marriage, for he would not have read those banns else, whatever the family's standing. But that is 30 years gone now, Miss Harrow, and I could not tell you where the proof of it lies, only that Obadiah was satisfied, and Obadiah was not a man easily satisfied of anything." "Do you know where she was buried?" Theodosia asked, and Mrs. Tovey shook her head slowly. But then, as though a further thought had only just surfaced from some long, undisturbed corner of memory, she said, Obadiah kept his daybooks, every one of them, going back to when he first took the clerk's place. When he grew too old to see well by candlelight, he had them all bound up together, a dozen little books into one great one, so they should not scatter and be lost after he was gone. He was very particular about who did the work, would not trust it to anyone in Hereford, sent it all the way to Leominster, to old Mr. Harrow, your own father, Miss Harrow, if I am not mistaken, since he said there was not a binder in the county he trusted better with something he meant to last. Theodosia sat very still. What became of the volume, she asked, when it was finished. I could not say for certain, Mrs. Tovey admitted. Obadiah fell ill not long after he sent it away, and was gone before the year was out, and I had a great deal else on my mind at the time, besides a book of old parish notes. I do not believe I ever collected it. I do not believe I ever thought of it again until this moment, sitting here with you. They rode back to Leominster that same afternoon, faster than either horse much cared for, and it was near dusk by the time Theodosia stood once more in her own workshop on Broad Street, in the low back room where her father had kept, for as long as she could remember, a shelf of finished work never collected, commissions paid for or half paid for, and then simply never claimed, gathering dust year upon year because a tradesman did not throw away another man's property merely because he had grown tired of waiting for it. She found it on the third shelf, wedged between a farmer's account book and a family Bible. Someone had ordered rebound for a wedding that, judging by the dust, had likely come and gone without it, a stout, plain volume in dark calf, and tooled, very small, upon the spine, in her own father's careful hand, the single word Tovey. She carried it to the bench with hands that were not, this time, entirely steady, and opened the boards, and found page after page of a clerk's careful, cramped hand, notes and memoranda, spanning better than 30 years of parish business. Baptisms and burials and marriages recorded first in rough and later fare, copied into the register proper, and near the middle of the volume, dated the 14th of June, 1814, in ink gone brown with age but perfectly legible. The marriage of Edmund Northmore and Frances Aylward, recorded in Obadiah Tovey's own hand on the very day it happened, and beneath it, in the same hand but added, she judged, some weeks later, a note that made her breath catch entirely. Made inquiry this day of Mr. E. Northmore touching the report of a former wife. Satisfies self, by sight of the burial entry at St. Michael's, Kingsland, that the said Susanna Northmore was buried the 2nd day of March in this present year, some 3 months before the solemnization above recorded. Proceeded with the marriage accordingly, having no lawful impediment before me. It was Julian, leaning over her shoulder in the lamplight, who read it a second time aloud, very quietly, as though he did not entirely trust himself to say it at ordinary volume, and when he had finished, he set his hand, briefly, flat upon the old page, the same gesture she had watched him make over the bishop's transcript weeks before, a man touching proof of who he truly was, as though it might, if handled too roughly, dissolve back into doubt. Kingsland, he said. The burial register at Kingsland will confirm it. We will ride there. In the morning, Theodosia said, and be certain of it ourselves before we carry a word of this to anyone. She wrapped the Tovey volume with the same careful hands she wrapped anything old and irreplaceable, and set it beside her notebook and the ledger fragment in the traveling case, and stood a long moment in the low back room of her father's workshop, looking at the shelf where the book had waited, unclaimed and unremembered, for the better part of 2 years, thinking that her father had bound it not knowing what it held, and that she had spent her whole life among his shelves, without once suspecting that the answer to a question not yet asked had been standing an arm's length away the entire time, patient as paper always was, waiting only for someone to trouble themselves to ask it what it knew. Fell arrived from Marlstone the following morning, summoned by an express letter. Julian had sent the moment the Tovey volume had been safely locked away for the night, and he examined the old day book at the workshop bench with the same slow, careful attention Theodosia had watched him give a dozen difficult deeds over the past 2 months, turning each page by its edge, holding certain leaves briefly to the light, before he finally sat back and removed his spectacles altogether. A gesture she had learned by now meant he had reached the bottom of his own considered judgment on a matter. "This will want careful presentation," he said. "A court is not always inclined to give a private day book the same weight it gives a document of formal record, whatever its evident age and evident honesty, and Prosser, or whoever argues for his lordship, now that the leaf substitution charge has collapsed beneath him, will certainly attempt to suggest the volume was got up for the purpose. However absurd, such a suggestion must appear to anyone who has actually examined it. We will want Mrs. Tovey herself to swear to its provenance, and your own father's workshop ledger, Miss Harrow, if it still records the commission and the date it was received, to fix beyond any argument that the volume passed into this shop's keeping a full 2 years before this present dispute had so much as been thought of by anyone." "I have already found the entry," Theodosia said, and showed him the page in her father's own commission book, dated and initialed in his familiar hand, Tovey, O, Day Books, 12 in number, to be bound as one volume, paid in full, a plain, unremarkable line among 100 others just like it, made in a year when neither her father nor anyone else living could have had the smallest notion of what quarrel it would one day be called upon to settle. Fell studied the entry a long moment, and something in his careful solicitor's manners softened briefly into something plainer. "Your father would have been very proud of this morning's work, Miss Harrow," he said. "I knew him only slightly, in the way one knows a good tradesman one has occasion to deal with over many years, but I remember him telling me once, when I brought him some damaged lease to mend, that a bookbinder's whole trade rested upon a single quiet article of faith, that nothing entrusted to careful keeping is ever entirely wasted, however long it sits unclaimed upon a shelf. I did not entirely understand him at the time. I believe I understand him rather better this morning." She did not trust herself to answer that at once, and it was Julian who spoke instead, asking Fell what remained to be done before the assizes could properly make use of what they now held, and the three of them worked on together at the bench until well past midnight, Fell drafting the formal statement that would accompany the volume into Onslow's keeping, Theodosia copying the disputed page a second, and then a third time in her own careful hand against the possibility that some further mischance might yet part them from the original before the court could see it, and what? Arriving late from the Crossroads Inn with a note from the ostler confirming when precisely he had first spoken to a stranger calling himself Garrick, adding his own small, hard-won piece to the whole patient structure they were building, stone upon stone, against whatever Marlstone's remaining defense might yet attempt to throw against it. It was Fell, gathering his papers together at last as the candles burned low, who said the thing that stayed with Theodosia longest of everything spoken that night. "I have practiced the law in this county for the better part of 30 years, he said, "and I have seen a great many disputes settled by clever argument, and rather fewer settled by the plain, patient recovery of a truth that never actually went anywhere at all, only waited, as this book waited, for someone honest enough and stubborn enough to go looking for it properly. I confess I did not expect, when I first wrote to Leominster asking for a competent hand to mend some fire-damaged papers, that I was setting in motion quite so thorough an education in exactly what that patience can accomplish." The burial register at St. Michael's, Kingsland, gave them, the following morning, precisely what Obadiah Tovey's daybook had promised it would. Theodosia found the entry herself, the vicar there a younger, brisker man than Hollis at Ardisland, who fetched the register without argument once Fell's letter of introduction had been read, and there, in a hand quite different from either the Ardisland register or the Tovey volume, a third and wholly independent witness, was recorded the burial of Susanna Northmore, wife of Edmund Northmore, gentleman, upon the 2nd day of March in the year 1814, aged 29 years, of a lingering consumption, 3 clear months before the second marriage that Prosser's notice had sought to call bigamous. 3 hands, Julian said quietly, when she had copied the entry into her notebook and set it beside the others. The parish register, the bishop's transcript, Tovey's own daybook, and now this. 4, if you count the burial itself as separate from the daybook's mention of it. How many more must a man produce before the truth is permitted to stand upon its own feet without further argument? As many as it takes to close every door your cousin might still try to open, Theodosia said, though she said it gently, understanding that the question had not truly been addressed to her at all. It was on the road back toward Hereford, in the late afternoon of that same long day, that they found Watt waiting for them at the Crossroads Inn where they had arranged, before setting out, to change horses, and it was plain from the moment Theodosia saw him, standing apart from the ostlers, with his hat twisted in both hands, that he had not come merely to see to the horses. "I have been thinking on it since the day it happened, miss," he said, before either of them had properly dismounted, the words coming out of him in a rush he seemed unable to slow. "I could not sleep for it. I would set it right if I knew how. Only I did not know whether you would ever wish to hear anything more from me at all." Julian's face had gone hard, and Theodosia laid a hand briefly upon his sleeve before he could speak, and turned instead to Watt with the same patient, unhurried attention she gave a difficult page. "Tell it properly, Watt, from the beginning, and tell it to us both, since it is Captain Northmore who has paid the heaviest price for whatever was done, and it is Captain Northmore who has the first right to hear it plainly." Watt told it, standing in the inn-yard with the horses, steaming gently in the cold air around them. The whole of it this time, not the fragments he had given in Mrs. Pruitt's stable, but the full account, how the man had first approached him at Marlstone, in the second week of Theodosia's work there, giving his name only as Garrick, a quiet, well-dressed man who Watt later understood, from a chance remark overheard between two grooms, to be his lordship's own confidential agent, a man who managed certain of the earl's private business that did not pass through Fell's hands at all. How Garrick had known, from the first conversation, more about the Colley family's debts than Watt's own father had ever confided to his son, and had used that knowledge with a patience that Watt, looking back on it now, understood to have been entirely deliberate, small requests growing steadily larger as the weeks passed, until the night before the consistory hearing, when Garrick had met him at Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen door, with a key that fit the passage from the stable yard into the Chancellor's own outbuildings, and a folded leaf already torn from somewhere, already prepared, that Watt was told only to see safely into the lining of Miss Harrow's traveling case, and no more than that. He swore it. He had never gone into the chambers himself, had never seen the volume stolen, only opened a door he had been told to open, and closed it again behind a man he never saw enter or leave by any other way. "Would you say all of this before a magistrate?" Julian asked, when Watt had finished and stood white and wretched in the fading light. "Would you say it under oath, knowing what it will cost you, since a court is not always inclined to deal gently with a man who confesses to opening doors for thieves, whatever his reasons?" "I would say it 100 times over, Captain," Watt said, "if it might undo 100th part of what has been done to you on my account. I have been a coward these 6 weeks past, and I would rather be thought a fool who told the truth too late than go on being thought an honest lad who never told it at all." They rode the last miles into Hereford in the dark, Watt between them now rather than trailing behind, and Theodosia found, watching him grip the reins with the white-knuckled determination of a boy, trying very hard not to weep in front of two people, whose good opinion he had forfeited, and was now attempting, however clumsily, to earn back, that she could not find in herself the anger she had expected still to feel. There was, instead, only a tired, complicated pity, and beneath it a colder and more useful clarity, the recognition that a boy's fear of losing his family's roof had been turned, by a patient and calculating man, into a weapon aimed at people who had never done Watt Colley any harm at all, and that the true weight of what had happened belonged, in the end, not upon the frightened instrument, but upon the hand that had wielded him. Mrs. Pruitt's own barrister, a brisk, gray-haired man named Onslow, whom she had retained the very week of Julian's committal, received the whole of it the following morning, with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a case that had looked hopeless a fortnight before suddenly, and all at once arrange itself into something he could put before a jury with confidence. "This changes the complexion of the matter entirely," Onslow said, laying out the assembled evidence upon Mrs. Pruitt's dining table, with the neat precision of a man accustomed to marshaling difficult facts into an orderly line, the ledger fragment at one end, the Tovey volume and the Kingsland entry beside it, Theodosia's notebook, Wardle's promised testimony, and now, at the far end, a boy's willingness to swear, under oath, to a chain of coercion running directly back to a man in his lordship's own employ. Captain Northmour's confession, false, though we now know it to have been, remains upon the record and must be formally addressed before the assize's judge, but a false confession made to shield an innocent party, when the true circumstances are laid before the court in full, is generally regarded rather differently than a confession left unexplained. The graver difficulty, and the graver opportunity both, lies with his lordship. We have here, if young Colley holds firm under examination, and if Garrick can be found and made to answer for his own part in it, sufficient to lay before the grand jury not merely a case of theft and subornation, but a case reaching back 18 years, to money that never should have left this county at all. And if Garrick cannot be found, Julian asked, if he has already been sent away, paid off, put beyond reach. Then we proceed upon what we have, Onslow said, which is a great deal more than most men bring to an assize's court, and I have known juries convicted upon considerably less than a torn ledger page, a boy's sworn confession, and the settled testimony of a diocesan registrar besides. But I will own to you both, since I think you have earned plain speaking rather than comfortable assurance, that his lordship is not a stupid man, and a not stupid man who has had 18 years to consider his position does not generally leave the whole of his defense resting upon the honesty of a single frightened servant. We must be ready for him to fight this to the very last inch of the courtroom floor. Garrick was found, in the end, 3 days before the sitting, not through any cleverness of Onslow's, but through the plain accident of an innkeeper at Bromyard, recognizing the name from a description Watt supplied. A man who had lodged there under a different name entirely for the better part of a fortnight, evidently waiting upon instructions that had not yet come, and who was taken up without resistance and lodged, pending the assizes, in the same county jail that had lately held Julian himself, a small bitter irony that Theodosia noticed and said nothing of, since there seemed nothing useful to say about it. Whether the frightened, cornered man that Garrick proved to be under Onslow's own patient, methodical questioning would hold to any bargain struck for his own leniency, whether he would name his employer plainly before a court, rather than simply beneath the private ceiling of a jail cell, remained, on the evening before the assizes opened, entirely unknown. And Theodosia lay awake a long while in Mrs. Pruitt's spare room, turning over every piece of the case she had assembled, testing each join and seam the way she tested a binding before she pronounced it sound, and found, for the first time since the letter had come naming her a thief, that she was no longer afraid of what the court might make of her, only impatient, at last, to stand before it and say plainly everything the paper itself had already told her. The Shire Hall at Hereford stood at the top of the town, a long classical front of gray stone that Theodosia had passed a dozen times without ever once imagining she would climb its steps as a witness in a criminal cause, and on the morning the assizes opened, she found the courtroom already half filled by the time. Onslow led her and Julian to the benches reserved for their side of the matter, the public gallery crowded with townsfolk who had heard, as such things were always heard, a garbled and much embroidered version of the whole affair, and who watched Marchant, seated composed and immaculate beside his own counsel at the far table, with the frank, unashamed curiosity of an audience that had paid nothing for its entertainment and meant to enjoy it thoroughly regardless. Mr. Justice Handley, who had ridden the circuit into Hereford only the evening before, was a spare, deliberate man of perhaps 60, with the unhurried manner of a judge, who had seen every variety of human folly paraded before him for the better part of 30 years, and had long since ceased to be surprised by any of it, and he opened the sitting with none of the drama the gallery had evidently come hoping for, only a brisk, business-like reading of the calendar, and the swearing of the jury, 12 solid, sober-faced men of the county, farmers and tradesmen for the most part, who Theodosia found herself studying with something of her own trade's habitual attention, wondering which of them would prove patient enough to follow the intricacies of ink and paper, she was about to lay before them, and which would want only the plain shape of the wrong done, without much care for the particulars that had proved it. The indictment, when it was read, named Selwyn Marchant, Earl of Rushford, upon two several counts. The first, that he did unlawfully conspire and combine with a person named Garrick, and did procure and incite one Walter Cawley to assist therein, to steal a document, namely a bishop's transcript held under seal, for the purposes of a suit then pending before the consistory court of the diocese, and further to place a portion of the said document, feloniously, and with intent to deceive, among the effects of one Theodosia Harrow, with intent to cause her to be suspected of theft, and the second, that he did, between the years 1823 and 1825, being then entrusted with the management of the Marlt estate, on behalf of his kinsman, falsify the accounts thereof, and did convert to his own use moneys belonging to the estate, to the value of some £1,100. Marchant's own counsel, a smooth, confident man from the Oxford circuit named Ledwell, rose first to enter a plea of not guilty upon both counts, and to observe, with a courtesy that did not entirely conceal its edge, that his client came before the court a peer of the realm, and a gentleman whose word had never, before this present unhappy business, been called into question by anyone, and that the prosecution's case, he ventured to suggest, would prove upon examination to rest upon the testimony of a frightened boy, eager to shift blame from himself, and the strained interpretation of old papers by a witness whose own conduct had already, upon one occasion, been formally questioned by this very diocese. Onslow, rising in his turn, said only that he was content to let the papers speak for themselves, and the witnesses besides, and that he would trouble the jury with no further speeches until the evidence itself had been heard, a restraint that Theodosia thought, watching the 12 solid faces in the jury box, served their cause rather better than a longer answer would have done. Wardle was called first, and gave his evidence plainly, and without embellishment. The sealing of the transcript volume, its removal into the chancellor's, keeping the night before the consistory hearing, its disappearance by morning, the forced lock that had shown, to his own eye and to a locksmith's besides, the marks of a skilled hand rather than a clumsy one. Ledwell's cross-examination pressed him hard upon whether he could say, of his own knowledge, who had taken the volume, and Wardle, an honest man to the bone, admitted freely that he could not, that he knew only that it was gone, and that a leaf of it had been found where it ought never to have been. And Ledwell sat down looking rather more satisfied with that admission than Theodosia liked. Watt was called next, and Theodosia watched him climb into the witness box, with his face the color of old parchment, his hands gripping the rail before him, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright, and give, in a voice that shook badly at first, and steadied only slowly, the whole of what he had already told them at the Crossroads Inn, Garrick's approach, the debt held over his family, the key, the leaf already prepared, and pressed into his hand, with instructions to see it hidden and no more. "You have told this court," Ledwell said, rising for his cross-examination with the unhurried confidence of a man who scented an easy victory, "that you never once, in the whole course of these dealings, heard the name of my client spoken. That the man Garrick gave you instructions in his own voice, and never once said he came from his lordship at all." "That is true, sir," Watt said. "Then how can this court be asked to believe that my client had any part in this matter whatsoever, rather than a servant acting entirely upon his own private and criminal design?" Watt was quiet a moment, and Theodosia saw his hands tighten further upon the rail, and then he said, more steadily than she had yet heard him speak, "Because Garrick knew things about my family's debt that only a man with access to my lordship's own Lord Steward's books could have, sir. Particulars of a mortgage held by a Leominster attorney that my own father had told no living soul outside our own four walls, and because when I asked Garrick, the very first evening, why a stranger should trouble himself so far over a bookbinder's apprentice, he told me, plain enough for any man to understand it, that his employer had a great deal riding upon Miss Harrow's good name being spoiled, before ever she took the witness stand, and that his employer was a man who did not care to be kept waiting for what he wanted." Ledwell attempted, for some minutes further, to shake the substance of this, but Watt held to it without wavering, and Theodosia understood, watching the jury's faces, that the boy's very rawness, his shaking hands and his unpolished, halting honesty, had done more to persuade them than any amount of practiced composure could have managed, since 12 solid men of the county knew well enough what a frightened, guilty conscience looked like, and knew equally well what a rehearsed lie looked like. And Watt Cawley's evidence had plainly been neither smooth nor rehearsed. Garrick himself was called after the noon recess, brought up from the jail under guard, a neat, gray-faced man who gave his evidence in the flat, careful tone of someone who had spent the better part of 3 days weighing, with Onslow's private assurances of leniency set against Ledwell's evident hope that he would say nothing at all, exactly how much truth he could afford to purchase his own future with. He confirmed, in terms considerably more cautious than Watt's, but substantially the same in their effect, that he had been retained some years before as his lordship's confidential agent for matters his lordship preferred, kept apart from the ordinary estate business conducted through Mr. Fell, that he had received instructions, delivered always by word of mouth, and never upon paper that his lordship's own hand had touched, to discover what leverage might be found over the apprentice Cawley, and later, once the transcript's existence and location had become known to his lordship, through channels Garrick did not claim to fully understand, to see the volume removed and a portion of it planted where it would do the greatest harm to Miss Harrow's credit. You say these instructions came always by word of mouth, Onslow said, and never upon paper touched by his lordship's own hand. Do you mean this court to understand that in some years of confidential service you never once received a single written direction from your employer? There was one exception, sir, Garrick said, and here for the first time something like genuine unease crossed his careful features. A note delivered to me at the Bromyard Inn some 10 days before the consistory hearing, instructing me to proceed as we had discussed and reminding me, in terms I confess I found rather pointed, that his lordship's patience with delay upon this particular matter, and I use his own words as near as I can recall them, was very nearly at an end, given all that hung upon Thornbeck being settled before the year was out. Have you that note still? Onslow asked, with the particular stillness of a man who already knew the answers and wished the court to hear it stated plainly. I have, sir, Garrick said. I did not destroy it. I confess I did not entirely trust that I should not one day have need of it myself. The note, when it was produced and passed first to the judge and then to the jury, was brief, unsiphoned, written in a hand that Theodosia, called at last to the witness box herself, once the note had been formally entered, was asked to examine and compare against a body of undisputed specimens, already lying upon the court's own table, the very notices Prosser had lodged against Julian's marriage claim, each bearing, at its foot, Marchant's own signature, sworn and undisputed by his own counsel as genuine, since he had relied upon them himself not 2 months before to press his case before the consistory court. I have spent the better part of my working life learning to read a hand the way another might read a face, Theodosia told the court, when Onslow asked her to explain her method, not merely the shape of the letters but the pressure of the pen. The particular habits a writer never troubles to alter because he does not know he possesses them at all. I have compared the unsigned note produced by the witness Garrick against 4 separate specimens of his lordship's undisputed hand, taken from documents his own counsel has this day acknowledged as genuine. The formation of the capital T, the peculiar backward pressure upon the crossbar, the curling return stroke beneath every terminal D, these appear identically in all 5 documents, the note and the 4 specimens alike. I would stake my professional reputation, which I have this year already once seen unjustly called into question, that all 5 were written by one and the same hand. She went on, then at Onslow's careful direction, through the whole of the remaining chain, the ledger fragment recovered from her father's own binding of the rental volume, its dating fixed beyond dispute by the ledger's own internal record of rents received in named years, its unexplained disbursements matched, entry for entry, against a second specimen of Marchant's hand, taken from an estate memorandum of the same period that Fell, called briefly to confirm its provenance, produced from the family's own surviving papers, and the Tovey Day Book and the Kingsland Burial Register both, laid before the jury not to speak to the theft or the embezzlement at all, but to demonstrate, beyond any further argument, precisely how much his lordship had stood to lose, and precisely how far he had been willing to go, once every other avenue of attack upon the Northmore marriage had been closed to him one by one. Ledwell rose for his cross-examination with rather less confidence than he had shown against Wardle or Watt, but he rose nonetheless, and began by observing, in the mild, regretful tone of a man merely doing an unpleasant duty, that this same witness had herself been formally suspected, not 3 months before this very court, of tampering with the identical class of ecclesiastical record she now claimed such particular authority to interpret. That suspicion arose, sir, from evidence since proved by this court's own verdict this morning to have been planted by the man now standing accused before you, Theodosia said, without heat, and I would ask the jury to consider which is the more remarkable circumstance, that a witness once falsely suspected should afterward be found entirely blameless, or that a man so anxious to have her disbelieved should have gone to such lengths and taken such risks to arrange the suspicion in the first place. Ledwell tried a different approach, pressing her upon whether a self-taught tradeswoman, however long practiced, could properly claim the same authority a court might extend to a trained expert, called from London or from the universities, and Theodosia answered him plainly that she had learned her trade at her father's bench rather than at any college, but that ink and paper obeyed the same laws of age and composition, whether examined by a bookbinder's daughter or by a doctor of laws, and that she would be glad to submit her findings to any further examination the court cared to appoint, since she had nothing in the whole of her testimony that she was not entirely willing to have tested again and again by anyone qualified to test it. He asked her, finally, whether it was not widely remarked upon, in a county where such things traveled quickly, that her acquaintance with Captain Northmore had grown, over the autumn, into something warmer than mere professional dealing, and whether such a warmth might not incline a witness, however honest her intentions, toward evidence that served the interests of a man she had come to regard with particular favor. I have asked myself precisely that question a great many times these past weeks, sir, Theodosia said, and I will answer it as honestly as I know how. I did not find the ledger fragment, because I wished Captain Northmore well. I found it because it was sewn into a binding I had been asked to mend, before I knew his true name at all, and every fact I have laid before this court this day was true before I ever felt any particular warmth toward the gentleman it happens to benefit, and would remain exactly as true if my feelings toward him were quite otherwise. Paper does not alter its testimony to suit a witness's affections, sir, whatever a witness's affections may happen to be, and I have been careful, throughout, to let it speak for itself rather than for me. Ledwell sat down not long after that, and Onslow, rising briefly to redirect, asked her only one further question, whether anything in the whole of her examination had been undertaken with any purpose beyond establishing what the documents themselves, honestly read, actually showed, and she answered simply that it had not, and the jury's faces, she thought, watching them as she stepped back from the rail, had heard rather more in that plain exchange than in anything Ledwell's careful questions had managed to unsettle. It was during this last portion of her evidence, as she set the Tovey volume open upon the rail before the jury, and read aloud the old clerk's careful note of his inquiry into Susanna Northmore's death, that Theodosia glanced, for the first time that day, directly across the courtroom at Marchant himself, and saw, upon his carefully composed face, something finally beginning to give way, not the frank, thin smile he had shown Julian once before in a different and more private reckoning, but something colder and more naked, the look of a man watching, piece by patient piece, the last remaining ground beneath his feet, being methodically dismantled by a woman he had once dismissed, in his own study, as a tradesman's daughter sent up from Leominster to mend paper. He rose before Ledwell could restrain him, his voice cutting across the courtroom with a violence that startled even the judge into a sharp rap of his gavel. "It was mine to have," he said. 18 years I managed that estate while my cousin sat useless in his chair and could not tell a rent roll from a hymn book, 18 years of holding the whole of it together with my own labor, while he took the credit and I took nothing. And when the title finally came to me, it came encumbered with debts he had let grow unchecked for a decade. And Thornbeck was the one clean thing left that might have settled them. And I will not sit here and be told by a bookbinder that I have no right to what my own work built. The gallery had gone entirely silent. Mr. Justice Handley, when he spoke again, did so with the flat, unhurried weight of a man who had, in that single unguarded outburst, heard rather more freely confessed than any amount of careful cross-examination could have extracted across a full week of sitting. You will have full opportunity, my lord, to make whatever case you wish before this jury, through your counsels and in proper form, he said. I would advise you strongly, in your own interest, to make no further such observations until that time. Marchant sat down slowly, his composure gathered back around him like a coat pulled tight against a wind that had already done its damage. But it was too late by then to matter a great deal, and Theodosia, stepping down at last from the witness box with her hands, she noticed with some distant surprise, entirely steady, understood that whatever the jury's formal deliberation might yet require in the way of time and procedure, the true verdict had already been spoken, by the accused's own mouth, in the one unguarded sentence a very careful man had, after 18 years of careful silence, finally allowed himself. The jury was out less than 40 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty upon both counts, and Mr. Justice Handley, after a brief and formal address touching upon the gravity of a betrayal committed by a man entrusted with a kinsman's confidence, and later with a public office of trust, besides, committed Selwyn Marchant for sentence at the close of the sessions, and ordered him remanded in the meantime, and it was done, in the end, with none of the drama the gallery had come hoping for, only the quiet, procedural closing of a door that 18 years of careful patience had never quite managed to keep shut. Julian's own matter was addressed the following morning, briefly, and almost as an afterthought, set against the weight of what had gone before, Mr. Justice Handley noting for the record that the confession earlier entered had been made, upon the fullest evidence now before the court, under circumstances that placed it in a wholly different light, a false statement offered to shield an innocent party from a scheme not of the confessor's own devising, and that he saw no proper cause, in light of Garrick's sworn testimony and the jury's own verdict, to proceed further against Captain Northmore upon that count. The charge was formally withdrawn. Julian stood in the dock only long enough to hear it, and Theodosia, watching from the gallery, saw the whole of the courtroom's attention pass over him and settle elsewhere within the space of a single sentence, the ordinary, unremarkable business of a wrong quietly and procedurally undone, so different in its quietness from the violence of the accusation that had first put him there. It did not, however, undo everything. The letter from his regimental agent reached him 3 days later, forwarded to Mrs. Pruitt's house, along with a second, shorter note from an officer who had once been his particular friend, expressing every sympathy and every private conviction of his innocence, and regretting, in the careful language such letters always employed, that a resignation once accepted by the proper authority could not, as a matter of settled practice, simply be recalled because the circumstances that had prompted it were later shown to have been other than they first appeared. The commission was gone. Whatever the court had said, whatever the county newspapers, which had by now taken up the whole affair with considerable relish, were beginning to print under headlines that called Julian a wronged man and a hero both, the army itself moved by its own slower and less forgiving clock, and a captaincy surrendered, however honorably, however mistakenly, did not simply return to a man's shoulder, because the reasons for its loss had proved, in the end, to be a lie told out of love. He took the letter to the small garden behind Mrs. Pruitt's house and sat with it a long while, and Theodosia, coming out to find him some hours later when the light had begun to fail, sat down beside him on the cold stone bench without at first saying anything at all, since she had learned by now that he did not always want to be spoken to, only to be sat beside. "I do not regret it," he said finally, without her having asked. "I want you to know that plainly, whatever else follows. I would say the same words again tomorrow, in that same chamber, knowing exactly what they would cost me, if it meant you did not spend a single night in a cell for a crime you never committed. I know it, she said. I have known it since the moment you said it the first time, though I confess I have wished, more than once these past weeks, that you had chosen some other way of proving it to me. There was no other way that came quickly enough, he said. I have turned it over a great many times since, wondering whether a cleverer man might have found one, and I cannot find it even now. Perhaps that is its own small comfort. A man who has genuinely searched for a better road and failed to find one need not torture himself quite so thoroughly over the road he took instead. She did not offer him easy comfort beyond that, since she had learned enough of him by now to know he would have distrusted it if she had. But she let her hand rest, after a moment, upon his where it lay upon the stone between them, and he did not draw it away, and they sat together in the failing light a good while longer, saying very little, the silence between them carrying, she thought, considerably more than either of them could yet have put properly into words. Marchant was brought up for sentence at the close of the sessions, 4 days after the verdict, and Theodosia went with Julian to hear it pronounced, though neither of them could afterward have said with any certainty why they had felt it necessary to sit through that final, formal hour, rather than simply await the news by letter. He stood in the dock, without the composure that had carried him through the earlier weeks of the dispute, his face gray and drawn in the plain daylight of the courtroom, and Mr. Justice Handley addressed him at some length before pronouncing the sentence itself, observing that the law no longer exacted the ultimate penalty for offenses of forgery and falsification, as it had within the memory of men not yet old, but that the law's mercy in that particular regard ought not to be mistaken by any man standing where the prisoner now stood, for any diminishment of the gravity of what he had done, a trust betrayed not once but twice over, first as a kinsman managing an ailing relative's affairs, and second as a peer of the realm who had sought to compound one theft with a second, crueler theft of another family's good name entirely. He was sentenced, upon the first count, to transportation beyond the seas for the term of 14 years, and upon the second, a lesser term to run concurrently, and he heard it without visible reaction, standing very still in the same attitude of careful composure he had worn on the first morning Theodosia ever saw him, surveying the ruined muniment room at Marlstone with an expression she had mistaken, then, for nothing more than the ordinary discomfort of a man confronting a loss. The consistory court reconvened 8 days after the assizes had closed, Sir Rowland Est sitting once more in his chancellor's robes in the same chamber where he had, weeks before, committed Julian for a crime he had not committed, and the proceeding this time was brief almost to the point of anticlimax, a formal reading of the evidence now standing wholly unchallenged, since Prosser, appearing this time not for Marchant, whose affairs had passed by now, into the hands of a receiver appointed to untangle what remained of the Marlstone estate's finances, but, for the estate itself, under its new and temporary management, offered no further contention at all. The notices withdrawn in a single dry sentence that seemed, to Theodosia, to want a great deal more ceremony than it received, given everything that had been paid to bring the court to precisely this point. The marriage of Edmund Northmore and Frances Aylward, solemnized at Irdisland upon the 14th day of June in the year 1814, Sir Rowland pronounced, is hereby found and declared good and valid in law, no lawful impediment having existed at the time of its solemnization, and Julian Edmund Northmore, born of that marriage, is hereby found and declared the lawful son and heir of the said Edmund Northmore, entitled in every particular to whatever inheritance descends to him by virtue of that lawful birth. It was, Theodosia thought, watching Julian receive the words standing very straight and very still beside her, a strange kind of victory arriving so quietly and so long after the worst of the cost had already been paid. The sort of ending her father had always warned her, real restorations rarely gave a person a page made whole again at last, but never quite forgetting, however carefully it was mended, that it had once been torn. Theodosia returned to Broad Street in the 3rd week of November, the orchards along the road already bare, and the first hard frosts silvering the hedgerows exactly as they had on the morning, 2 months before, When she had first set out for Marlstone, with her satchel of tools braced between her boots and no notion at all of what she was riding toward. The shop had stood empty the whole time, save for a neighbor's boy paid to feed the stove and keep the damp from the stock, and she spent her first days home simply setting it to rights again. The small, ordinary satisfactions of dusted shelves and freshly mixed paste, work that had asked nothing more difficult of her hands than the work itself. The letters began arriving within a fortnight of the Hereford newspapers, carrying the fuller account of the trial, and they were, this time, of a very different character to the one that had come from Mrs. Kenrick 2 months before. Mrs. Kenrick herself wrote first, a long apologetic letter that arrived with the canon's own sermon notes enclosed, begging Miss Harrow's forgiveness for having lent her ear too readily to idle talk, and trusting that Miss Harrow's evident skill, now so publicly and so thoroughly vindicated, might still be persuaded to undertake the work originally proposed, at whatever fee Miss Harrow now judged proper, given all the trouble occasioned. 3 further commissions followed within the month, from clients she had never before had occasion to serve, and Watt, restored to his place at the bench with a gravity about him that had not been there before the autumn, remarked one evening, not without a certain wry satisfaction, that his mistress's misfortune appeared, in the strange arithmetic of county gossip, to have done rather more for the shop's reputation than a decade of honest, uneventful work had ever managed. Fell's letter came a little later than the rest, in early December, and asked something rather different of her than any commission she had yet undertaken. The Marlstone estate, he wrote, remained for the present in the careful hands of trustees appointed by the court, the question of the earldom's own succession being a matter for the College of Arms, and, in time, for Parliament itself to settle, a process he did not expect to see concluded within his own lifetime, given how slowly such questions generally moved. But the trustees were united, he assured her, in wishing the muniment room completed properly and without further interruption, and united also, he added, with what she suspected was his own particular satisfaction, showing through the solicitor's careful phrasing, in wishing the work entrusted entirely to the one person who had, this past autumn, proved beyond any further argument exactly what her father's trade, properly practiced, was capable of uncovering. She accepted the commission within the week, and rode up to Marlstone one last time before Christmas to see the Northern Press opened. At last, its contents catalogued in the ordinary light of an ordinary working day. No secrets left in it now, beyond the small patient secrets that any old family's papers always kept, nothing more sinister than they. She had imagined across the whole autumn of dispute and accusation that the press must hold within it something of great and dramatic weight, a further scheme, a further deception, some final piece of villainy still waiting to be uncovered, and she found, once the warped door was finally eased open under her own steady hands, with Watt beside her holding the light, that it held nothing of the sort at all, only what Marchant had told her the very first day, family correspondence of no legal consequence whatsoever, save that it was, she understood now, precisely because it held no legal consequence, that he had wished it kept from her longest, since it was here, among letters written across 3 generations of ordinary family feeling, birthday wishes and condolences, and small domestic news, that the truest portrait of who the Northmores actually were, apart from any dispute over land or title, had been quietly waiting the whole time. She found 6 further letters in the same careful, rounded boyhood hand. She had first noticed in the letter, thanking a great uncle for a pocket knife, Julian at 7, at 10, at 13, the hand growing steadily more assured with each passing year, a whole quiet history of a child, becoming a man that no court proceeding, however thorough, had ever troubled to consider, and she catalogued them last of all the papers in the room. Entering each into her ledger of finished work with a particular care she did not trouble to explain to Watt, who noticed it nonetheless and said nothing, only handed her each fragile sheet in turn with a gentleness that told her he understood well enough what she was about without needing to be told. Fell found her there at the end of the day, the last press finally emptied and its contents sorted and dried and laid, in order upon the long table, the muniment room whole again, for the first time since the fire, if not exactly as it had been before, Since no restoration, her father had always told her, ever truly returned a thing to precisely its former state, only to a state honestly and carefully made new. "You have finished it," he said, standing in the doorway with something like wonder in his voice. "I have finished what fire and mischief left me to finish," she said. The rest was never really mine to mend. It only wanted someone patient enough to ask it what it already knew. Thornbeck, when she rode out to see it for the first time, on a bright cold morning in the new year, at Julian's own particular invitation, proved to be nothing like the grand seat she had half pictured through all the months of hearing it fought over. It was a modest, honest house of red Herefordshire stone, low-built and comfortable rather than imposing, standing at the edge of a stretch of old cider orchard that ran down toward a small stream, the trees bare now but planted, Julian told her, walking her along the rows with his hands clasped behind his back in a manner she had come to know, meant he was working up to something he had not yet found the easy words for by his own grandfather's grandfather, the very man whose careful deed of settlement had, 100 years on, finally done what it was always meant to do. "I have been offered a place," he said, as they came to the end of the orchard row and stood looking back at the house, low and solid against the winter sky. "A friend from my old regiment, retired now himself, has taken up the management of a survey concern, honest work, mapping and boundaries, and the like, the very trade I once borrowed a false name from. He tells me there would be a place for a man who knows the county well, and has, as he put it rather too kindly, a certain proven talent for uncovering what other men have taken pains to hide. I find to my own surprise that I do not mind the idea of it half so much as I once thought I would mind losing the coat altogether." "That is a fine thing," she said, and meant it. "It is not the life I planned," he said. "I do not know that any of what has happened this past year is the life either of us planned. When you climbed down from that carriage at Marlstone in October, with your bone folder and your satchel, and no more notion of me than you had of the man in the moon." "No," she agreed. "I had planned, if I had planned anything at all, a quiet season of steaming pages apart and drying them under weight. And instead, I have stood accused of theft before a diocesan chancellor, and given evidence at an assize's trial, and learned a great deal more about the private business of two noble families than any bookbinder in Leominster has any proper right to know." He turned to face her then, fully, the easy, meandering conversation falling away from his manner all at once, and she saw the same careful, deliberate stillness in him that she had first noticed the very day they met, the stillness of a man weighing exactly how much a single sentence could be made to carry before he trusted himself to say it aloud. "I have Thornbeck now, lawfully and beyond any further challenge," he said, "and I have, I think, a decent enough prospect of honest work besides, and neither of those things, Theodosia, is the thing I most wish to have settled before this winter is out. I have known you 5 months. I have watched you work with more patience and more honesty than I have ever seen in any man of my own former profession, and I have come, somewhere in the middle of all this trouble, to want your good opinion a great deal more than I ever wanted my commission back, though I would not have believed that possible when this began. I am asking, as plainly as I know how to ask anything, whether you would consent to make your home here, at Thornbeck, as my wife, and whether you would consider a shop on Broad Street, and an orchard house 7 miles apart a distance, small enough to be managed by 2 people who have already, between them, ridden considerably further than that for considerably less certain reasons." Theodosia looked past him for a moment, at the low red house and the bare orchard, and the thin winter sun lying pale across the whole of it, and thought of her father, who had told her once, setting a damaged leaf before her when she was 9 years old, that paper forgave a great deal if a person was patient enough and honest enough in the mending of it, and thought that perhaps the same might be said, in the end, of people too. "I would consider it a distance very easily managed indeed," she said, and he crossed the last few feet of frozen ground between them, and took her hands in both of his, and neither of them said anything further for a good while after that, the orchard silent around them, the small stream running on unhurried at the bottom of the slope, and somewhere behind them, in the house that was now, beyond any further dispute, entirely his own, a servant lit the first fire of the afternoon, and a thin curl of smoke rose gray and steady into the pale Herefordshire sky. They were married in April, once the orchards along the Thornbeck slopes had come into their first white blossom, and Julian would hear of no other church for the purpose than the small, plain parish church at Eardisland, the same building in which his own parents had stood some 30 years before, and in which the whole long dispute over his name had first been laid open by a discrepancy of ink that a careful woman's eye had known, from the very first afternoon, to be no discrepancy at all. The vicar Hollis, considerably less bewildered by this second visit than he had been by the first, read the service in a clear, steady voice, and Theodosia stood before him in a gown of soft gray wool, since she had never much cared for finer stuffs and saw no reason to begin caring for them now, with Mrs. Pruitt weeping happily in the front pew and Fell standing a little apart, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead in the manner she had come to know so well, and Watt scrubbed and solemn in a new coat he had insisted upon paying for himself out of his own wages, standing at the back of the church with an expression of such fierce protective pride that she found herself, in the middle of her own wedding vows, having to look away from him briefly for fear of losing her composure entirely. Afterward, in the small register kept in the vestry, the very register whose ink she had once spent 2 careful hours examining leaf by leaf, the vicar entered the marriage of Julian Edmund Northmore, bachelor, of Thornbeck in this county, and Theodosia Harrow, spinster of Leominster, and Theodosia, watching him write it, thought that she had never before understood quite how strange and quite how satisfying it could feel to watch a fresh line added to a book she had once studied so anxiously for evidence of an old one, the same steady hand, the same plain black ink, recording nothing more remarkable this time than an ordinary happiness that no one in any court in England would ever have the smallest cause to question. Some forgeries fail because the ink betrays them, and some marriages, and some good names besides, are only ever mended because someone patient enough troubles herself to read what a page has left unsaid, and Theodosia Harrow, riding back into Leominster that evening, with her heart considerably fuller than it had been that morning, thought that her father had been right about a great many things in his life, but never more right than in the one lesson he had given her before all the others, that nothing set down upon paper, however carefully burned or buried or torn away, is ever truly lost to a person who has learned, properly and patiently, how to ask it what it remembers.